Oh, please, yeah. Let's go behind you. I'm right next to you. Perfect. Make sure Senator Jones can get in.
Nice to meet you.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Congresswoman Terri Sewell, and I proudly represent Alabama's 7th Congressional District, which includes the historic cities of Birmingham, Montgomery, my hometown of Selma, and today in my role as ranking member of the Subcommittee on Elections for the House Administrative Committee, the Committee on House Administration for the United States House of Representatives. We're hosting this symposium that really is to mark the 10th anniversary of the Shelby decision. We know that the Shelby decision was decided in 2013. It had amazing ramifications and impact, but we're here to talk with leading experts and stakeholders and activists around voting rights to really talk about what it means, the impact of it, and then of course our second panel will be on moving forward. Now what? But to start us off, I'd like to first thank the amazing pastor of this wonderful, beautiful sanctuary, 16th Street Baptist Church, Reverend Price. If you would come up and give us an opening prayer. Again, thank you, sir, for always opening up this beautiful edifice for community meetings, and we're just thrilled to have the opportunity to be in this midst, in this place. So thank you, sir.
Let's bow for a word of prayer. Dear Heavenly Father, we thank you for the chance and the privilege to be in this space today as we seek wisdom, guidance, and understanding about the essential and fundamental right to vote. God, we acknowledge that you are the giver of every good and perfect gift, including the gift of participating in this democracy, which gives us the privilege to vote. God, as we come in this place today, we acknowledge, oh God, those heroes and heroines who stood before us, who secured and protected the right to vote. We remember the amazing foot soldiers who fought against injustice, inequality, and inequity to make sure that we have this right to vote. So now as we come into this space today, we ask, oh God, for your leadership, your guidance, and understanding as the voices communicate why this right to vote is so essential. We ask, oh God, that you would allow their words to comfort us, to give us understanding, and, oh God, to let the world know that what they did many years ago is still relevant today. It's in the precious name of Jesus I pray. Amen.
Amen. I'll begin with opening remarks, and then we'll go straight to our panel. I again want to thank Reverend Price and the congregants of the 16th Street Baptist Church here in Birmingham, Alabama, for their generous ability to host this wonderful forum. I want to thank the staff, my staff of Team Sewell, the 7th Congressional District, as well as the staff of the House Administration Committee for a job well done. Today's symposium is entitled Shelby County, a Decade Later, the Path Forward in Our Ongoing Fight for the Right to Vote. We are gathered today because this past Sunday marked the 10th anniversary of the Supreme Court's disastrous decision in Shelby County versus Holder. On June 25th, 2013, the court gutted key provisions of the Voting Rights Act of 1965, a landmark civil rights law that for decades prevented states from restricting the right to vote. Specifically, the case invalidated a critical component of the Voting Rights Act, the formula that determined which states and local jurisdictions had to submit the changes that they wanted to make to their voting laws to the Department of Justice or a federal court for pre-clearance to ensure that they were not racially discriminatory. This was a very important prophylactic measure because it stopped really restrictive laws from going into effect before the law was passed. For decades, the Voting Rights Act blocked discriminatory voting laws before they would take effect, serving as an important guard against the forces that had, throughout our history, sought to silence and suppress the voices of millions of voters of color. In its decision, the Supreme Court declared that voting discrimination was an issue of the past. After all, we had an African-American president, a president of the United States that was African-American at the time. They were wrong. Immediately, states enacted laws to purge voter rolls, close polling stations, and restrict voter access. Many laws targeted minority communities, including right here in Alabama. And attacks on the VRA have continued. The Supreme Court in 2021 opinion in Bronovich versus DNC further hampered the law's protection and cleared the way for states to pass more discriminatory laws, put up barriers to voting, chase problems that did not exist, and enact laws that fueled the spreading of lies about the integrity of our elections and a backlash against increased voter participation. When the Supreme Court decided the Shelby decision, Chief Justice Roberts himself wrote that, quote, "Voting discrimination still exists. No one doubts that," end quote. And yet the court opened the doors for a new age of discriminatory voting laws. In my role as ranking member of the Subcommittee on Elections and as a member of the House Committee on House Administration, I have listened as my colleagues across the aisle have tried to argue that the restrictive voting laws that we have seen enacted across this country are just fine, pointing to the voter turnout numbers in recent elections. Now, we know that we have turned out in spite of these discriminatory suppressive laws, not because of them. But these numbers alone do not tell the full story. In fact, a recent report published by the Brennan Center for Justice just last week found that racial turnout gaps has actually increased significantly in Alabama in the past 10 years. And Alabama is not alone. This has happened in states across this nation, especially the Deep South. While we celebrate increases in voter participation, we cannot use this progress as a justification to roll back protections for those Americans who fought for centuries to have their voice in our democracy counted. As my dear friend and late colleague, the Honorable John Lewis would say, the vote is precious. It's almost sacred. Pro-voters, activists, and lawmakers have not stopped fighting to protect our constitutional right to vote. I am proud to be the lead sponsor of the John Robert Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, the seminal piece of legislation in the United States Congress that will fully restore the protections of the VRA. And I stand with my Democratic colleagues on also passing the Freedom to Vote Act, which would gain more voter access across this nation. Those two pieces of legislation are the key to unlocking a lot of the voter suppression that we see across this nation. But we know that there are always fights that we have to have. And the United States Senate has a very archaic, if I do say so myself, procedural rule called the filibuster that time and time again has stopped these important measures from actually getting a voice on the United States Senate floor. We know that if we could get it on the floor, you need 60 votes because of the filibuster to do that, that we could perhaps get 51 votes to actually pass this legislation. It goes to show you that your vote matters. Our votes matter, and we have to make sure that we're voting in every election. Rain, snow, sleet, federal, state, or local. Generations of Americans fought for the right to vote, many right here in the city of Birmingham and throughout the 7th Congressional District. I am proud to represent overcoming barriers and violence to move forward this fight in our democracy. I always say, that John Lewis famously said that ours is not the fight of one day, 1 week, or even 1 year. The fight for voting rights is a fight of a lifetime, and every generation must hold on to the progress that we've already made and try to advance it. Today's discussion will focus first on the impact of the Shelby decision on voting rights and voter access over the last 10 years, and then on the road ahead. To begin, I want to introduce our first panel. We are so honored today to be joined by these amazing experts, activists, and leaders in voting rights. Maya Wiley is the president and CEO of the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights. Doug Jones is our forever U.S. Congressman, Senator from Alabama. Doug is a former U.S. Senator serving the great state of Alabama from 2018 to 2021 and will forever be our senator. Tom Saenz is the president and general counsel of MALDOF, the Mexican-American Legal Defense and Education Fund. Tona Boyd is the associate director counsel of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. Jacqueline DeLeon serves as the senior counsel at the Native American Rights Fund. And Dewana Thompson, our very own native of Birmingham, Alabama, is the president and CEO of the Birmingham Civil Rights and also led the effort for Woke Vote in 2020. Thank all of our panelists. Some housekeeping rules. We hope to have some time for questions to be asked of our audience. At the end of every bench is an index card and some pencils. If you have a question, please raise your hand, and one of the staffers from the House Administration Committee will come and provide you with the card and the pencil if you don't have one at your seat. Can you all silence your cell phones so that we can have this discussion uninterrupted? We are videotaping it because we are the United States House of Representatives, a House on Administration, Subcommittee on Elections, and we want to preserve this discussion for future generations. So I'm going to ask questions instead of giving all of our amazing panelists an opportunity to provide introductory remarks. I believe that we'll get to all of your introductory remarks by the questions that I'm asking. I'll start with our forever senator from the state of Alabama, Doug Jones. Doug, can you talk to us about what the Shelby Holder decision did for states across this nation in allowing them to go unchecked with having suppressive and restrictive laws, and especially right here in the state of Alabama?
Well, thanks, Terri, and I'm honored to be here with you today. I really appreciate. You know, Terri has become, since the death of John Lewis, the champion for voting rights in the halls of the United States Congress, and we should be very proud of you for that. You know, look, you said it best. The Shelby County versus Holder decision allowed states really a lot of unfettered ability to restrict voting in the name of fraud, in the name of whatever they want to make it. And Alabama is unfortunately the way we have done over the years since the Civil War. We have kind of led the way when we have the ability to restrict voting. We are always on the front lines, right there at the front, leading the charge. And we started immediately after the Shelby County decision by enacting a very stringent voter ID law, which I think everyone understands and knows. Statistics show that that really affects communities of color more than it affects anyone else. And the problem Alabama had, particularly, is in the number of IDs. They restrict the number of IDs. And also, Alabama has done a pretty good job of registering people to vote. But then we just make it hard to get to vote. You've got to go between 7 a.m. and 7 p.m. on one day, no matter what is going on in your life, no matter what is going on with the weather. That is the time you vote. And if you want to vote absentee, you've got to jump through a whole bunch of hoops. If you want to vote early, you can't just vote early in Alabama. You got to vote absentee early in Alabama. It's just a bizarre way of looking at things. But we make it very difficult. And everybody said voter IDs would not hurt, whatever, but we didn't give access to people to get the voter IDs. You know, we get 1 or 2 vans for the entire state of Alabama that if you call specifically, they'll travel to you, but that is not going to get the voter IDs in the way that it should be. We closed places. We closed, in the Black Belt in particular, they started closing the DMVs, and there had to be lawsuits on all of that. So what we have seen, that began the process. And after 2020 election, when all of a sudden it was in vogue for certain members of this country to say the election was stolen, state legislators really stepped that up a notch. We may have led the way, but we're still farther behind states like Texas and Georgia and some others who are really doing everything possible to restrict people's access to the vote, which is kind of counter. And if you look, yes, we have seen, and I think you alluded to this, we have seen some record numbers in the number of people voting, but it's still low. And in the states that were affected by the Voting Rights Act and what the Shelby County decision did, in those states, our voting is still below the national average in every state, I think maybe except one, even in Georgia, where we think Georgia has really come alive in terms of its vote. It is still below the national average, and we got to reverse that.
Absolutely. Maya, as the, can you guys hear me? Okay. As the leader of, and the executive director of the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights, you are a convening organization of more than 200 justice-based organizations. How has, in the wake of the Shelby County decision, these ensuing attacks on voting rights affected your organization and your big ability to organize? And secondly, do you think that the setbacks that we've seen in voting rights also affect other fundamental rights that we have in the society? And thank you again for being here.
Well, first let me say it's a real honor to be here, and I just want to acknowledge that we are on hallowed ground, and it is a moment we should all mark as we think about the rights that we have fought so hard for collectively being under attack, and the price that so many have paid for being willing to stand up for rights. And I think this is part of the hallowed ground that we're on. So I want to acknowledge that. I also want to acknowledge that I am here in a coalition with our coalition partners, all of whom you're going to hear from, proudly so. So a lot of what I'm going to say is collective effort, is coalitional effort. And for those of you who don't know, the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights is literally the oldest and largest civil rights coalition in the country, founded 73 years ago to be the lobbying arm of the civil rights movement by the NAACP, by the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, and by one of the most critical Jewish leading organizations, civil rights organizations in the country. So we've always been a coalition. We have always been multiracial. We're also multi-religious. We also represent what is, and I will say unabashedly, are the viewpoints of a majority of this country, with organizations almost 250 strong that look like this country and live like everyone in this country and all that that represents. So I say that to start by saying first and foremost, I want to step backwards. I want to do a little Sankofa. You all know what Sankofa means, right? Got to look backward and move forward. All right, that's what we do. So little Sankofa is just because it matters to answer the question about how we're operating and why it is so important that we be in coalition and what this coalition is doing. One is because remember, and Congresswoman Sewell has been such an incredible leader on these issues, said it. You know, Barack Obama won in 2008, and that was the beginning of seeing the end of bipartisanship on voting rights. Because in 2006, just 2 years before we got the first black president, because the country came and said we're going to pick the best person for the job, not the white person for the job, that he literally, that win showed after 2006, where George Bush, four Republican presidents before George Bush, all stood up for voting rights, the Voting Rights Act, where very few members of Congress, no matter their party, were willing to cast a vote against it, even in 2006. What changed was Barack Obama won in 2008. It was record and historic turnout by a changing demographic that was increasingly diverse in this country. And what that portended for people who wanted to stay in power was, rather than to contest for our votes, they decided to make it hard for us to. That's what happened. And I am saying this as someone, we are not a partisan organization or a coalition. We work and do not tell people who to vote for, and we are not standing with one party or the other. But that's why I'm pointing to where we had bipartisanship, and what has happened is really about power. So what we have done moving forward, and Senator already laid out eloquently a lot of what has been thrown in our way, is it has required us to recognize, one, that this is all of our fight. I think you'll hear from Jacqueline. I think you'll hear from Tom. I know you'll hear from Dewana and others. No matter our communities, we are experiencing the impact as a people who are increasingly coming into our power. And all of these efforts have been, in some instances, explicitly, whether it was Florida with a Republican Party operative, Wisconsin with a Republican Party operative. I'm pointing these because they're facts, not political statements. Facts saying if we pass these voter restrictions, it will be harder for black people to vote. If we pass these voter restrictions, it'll be harder for Milwaukee to vote. Code for black people, right? It's surgical, it's understood, it's why we see that's why we see polling sites being closed disproportionately in communities of color. It's why, because we have a lot of people in color in rural areas, it's why we see the attack even here in Alabama just recently on trying to ban any support for absentee balloting. Any support. And we know what that means for our elderly. We know what that means for our people with disabilities. We know what it means for people who don't have access to the polls. So this coalition is actually working on all those issues. You've got our legal experts up here because the litigation has been critical and important, including to some of our wins. And then we back it up, and Y.T. Bell is here somewhere, who's our state's director. Y.T. Yes. Georgia-based, but working across not just this region, but also across the country with our coalitional partners to say, when we see these laws pop up, we will organize and support the efforts to educate people on what's happening and support their engagement. We make sure that when our litigators need us to elevate where and how we have to have our voices heard, because something is happening. I'll give you a really practical example, came out of Georgia, and YT helped work on this. So Fulton County in the midterms, there was a video in Fulton County of people gathering and depositing ballots in mail-in drop boxes. It's legal behavior and activity. That video went viral on YouTube, and then you heard in Arizona, another swing state that had been having repressive laws, this literally politicians stand up, use this video and lie about it and suggest it was illegal ballot box stuffing and therefore voter fraud, and then calling on vigilantes to show up and guard mail drop boxes. So if we, and they did.
Yeah, sure.
With guns. Which, and now you want to go drop off your mail and you see guns at a drop, what are you going to do? I've been black all my life. I'm going in the other direction. Okay? So this is the point. They understand. Now, fortunately, because of the coalitional efforts, it was identified. There was a communication about it, working with the social platforms to pull the video off and down, and also the lawyers jumping into action, but also getting the community to come out and support the court action and be on those court steps and show, because I tell you it matters for courts to understand that people see, feel, and experience the very things the lawyers are in the courtroom talking about. We'll also working on voter registration, but also education, because as we see the proliferation, Georgia, Florida, Texas, the proliferation of trying to criminalize and scare people from voting or to put them back in prison because they think they're lawfully able to vote. They're returning citizens, and they're being criminalized for being told sometimes the wrong information about whether they can vote. They go show up by their election administrator, and then the police swoop in and revoke their parole. So we're seeing people criminalized for just trying to be citizens. So I just say all that because we are fighting all of those fights, but we can only do it because we're together and because we're everywhere and we have everyone. And that's what I want you all to hear, because you are part of everyone. And everything we do together matters, and it matters for us to share our experiences about it, and just how much a very powerful few are trying to prevent the majority of us from having a say. And that will not stand.
Thank you. So, Tona, you represent the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. We all know the amazing work that so many of the legal groups that are here on this dais. And I wanted to ask you, since the Shelby decision, I can only imagine that all of the litigants on this have been overwhelmingly, busy in the courts. And so, can you talk to us a little bit about what the Shelby decision did in terms of the ability of legal groups such as LDF to actually win cases in court? How has your docket changed, and how has your strategy changed in the wake of the Shelby decision?
Certainly, and I just want to say again, thank you so much for having me. It's such an honor to be here, and it's such an honor to be on such hallowed ground representing the Legal Defense Fund. LDF has been fighting for the full citizenship of Black people in this country since 1940. We've been doing it in the education space, in Brown versus Board of Education. We've been fighting for full political participation, and so it is sobering to observe what has occurred since Shelby was decided. We are an organization that has obviously looked to the Supreme Court to protect and defend civil rights, turning again back to Brown. And so to see what happened in Shelby was incredibly disappointing. And it really did impact the way that we had to use our resources in terms of litigation. And so we have had to shift the cases that we bring to fight cases in states that were previously covered by Shelby. So states that used to have any voting laws and election-related laws cleared now had carte blanche to move forward with provisions that are designed not to increase participation, but to suppress it. And so we've outlined some of those impacts in a report that we put together called Democracy Diminished, that you can find on our website. We've also had to expand our voting protection game, frankly. So our Voting Rights Defender and Prepared to Vote programs, we've had to put a lot more resources there to ensure that folks are still able to fully participate in elections. And I want to highlight and pick up on another trend that we've noticed that I think Maya also started to speak about, and that is a real effort that we've seen to subvert the will of Black communities. So when folks have fought through the rain and waited in lines and had to do so without water or any assistance, without rides, and they've made their will known, you see that there's a backlash to what folks have come and used their ballot to say. And so, for example, we saw that in Washington, D.C., where Congress literally rolled back important criminal justice reforms that were enacted by the people of Washington, D.C., a Black community. We saw that in Tennessee when the State House reprehensibly tried to expel 2 Black members for raising their voices in an important debate about gun control. And we've seen this happen right next door in Mississippi with HB 1020, which was signed into law. That is a bill that I think is quite alarming. It is one in which folks have tried to prevent Jackson, Mississippi, which is a city that is 83% Black. It's where my people come from, my mother and grandmother, tried to prevent them from getting to elect their own judges. And so this law would have the chief judge and not the people of Jackson select their judicial officials. And that is a blatant violation of Mississippi's Constitution, which says that those officials should be elected by the people. And so that's an example where LDF, along with some of our allies, brought a case challenging that in court. It's incredibly important to do so. And I want to share a quote from one of our clients in that case. She said, "State lawmakers have said that this takeover of our judicial system is for our own good, for our own safety, and that is deeply offensive to me. African Americans in Mississippi died so that we had the right to vote. How does weakening the right to self-governance make us safer?" And so that's the kind of thing that's on the line now that Shelby has removed the protections of preclearance. Because I have to say, Mississippi would have had to clear that change if Section 5 had still been in place. And so that's what we are doing in order to fight these battles. We've shifted our resources because it's critical that we continue to push back even without the tool of preclearance.
Thank you. So Tom, we know that this is about coalition building, that the African American community is not the only community that has been affected by the Shelby decision. MALDOF, the Mexican American Legal and Educational Fund, has been on the forefront of representing people. And so can you talk a little bit about how it's affected your ability, MALDOF's ability, and Hispanic Americans, Mexican Americans, from having the opportunity to vote? And talk a little bit also, if you can, about the coalition, because we're united, minority voters are, on the fact that they're not just trying to affect our community, they're trying to affect all of our community. Thanks, Tom.
Absolutely. I think the best measure of that, Congressmember, is what followed immediately after the Shelby County decision was rendered. And that was, you saw two things happen in Texas, second most populous state. First, a state official tweeted out that this meant they could become even more restrictive about voter ID requirements in Texas elections. So saw Shelby County as giving a green light to further restricting the ability of people of color, blacks and Latinos in Texas, to vote and participate in making decisions for that all-important state. So I begin with that and couple it with what happened at a local level in Texas, just to give a flavor of how this affects not just what occurs at a national level, which it certainly does. In fact, I will say that but for Shelby County, Texas would be a swing state today. And that is because largely the growth of the Latino community in Texas means that it eventually will be a swing state. The slower it gets there is the result of things like Shelby County and decisions made by the Texas state legislature to further restrict participation. But it happens at local level as well, because right after the state leader tweeted about voter ID, a mayor of Pasadena, Texas, announced that he would pursue a change that he had sought for a long time, but that he openly admitted he couldn't achieve because of the preclearance requirements that existed prior to Shelby County. And what he wanted to do was take an 8-member city council, which was elected from 8 districts, and shift it to 6 districts and 2 at-large seats. Now, why would he want to do that? He wanted to do that because the Latino population of Pasadena, Texas, had reached a point where it was on the cusp of electing a majority of those 8 districted city council members. So if he shifts 2 of them to at-large, and he takes advantage of the fact that voter turnout is higher for white voters in Pasadena, Texas than Latino voters, he knew that he could cement in place white control of an increasingly Latino city for the foreseeable future. And he saw that Shelby County was his green light to engage in that kind of nefarious restructuring of government, yes, just to prevent the majority of the city from actually deciding what happened in that city. So the removal of preclearance, which, going back to Maya's theme of bipartisan, folks from across the spectrum had identified preclearance, what was struck down in Shelby County, as the most effective federal civil rights law in United States history. That's how much esteem this provision had across the political spectrum. And that gives you a measure of what was taken away by a bare majority of 5 justices. But I want to pivot to today and emphasize another impact of the Shelby County decision, and that is a pronounced lack of transparency in what is happening at local levels across the country to suppress voter participation, particularly by voters of color. Prior to Shelby County, if you had a city in a covered jurisdiction, and for the Latino community that included all of Texas and all of Arizona, 2 states of particular and ongoing concern when it comes to vote suppression for the Latino community. But any jurisdiction within a covered jurisdiction, covered state, would have to take their changes, even moving precincts, and submit them affirmatively to the Department of Justice. That meant we knew in advance what they were going to be trying to do to make it harder for people of color to vote. But when Shelby County took away that pre-clearance obligation, they don't have to tell us in advance anymore. And what that means is that local registrars can start moving around precincts and not reveal it publicly until the cusp of the election. And you couple that with the Supreme Court and its ill-defined Purcell doctrine, a doctrine that says you can't make any changes if it's too close to the election, and we are in an incredibly impossible spot. We don't know about some of these changes until it is too late to go into court under Supreme Court doctrine and change what they are trying to do. And I'm going to give you one last aspect of that lack of transparency. Because they don't have to submit the changes they're making and the evidence to support those changes. They are now taking advantage of every opportunity to hide what is going on in our democratic instruments of government. Today in Texas, we're in the middle of litigation around redistricting. And we're in litigation on redistricting in Texas every decade, sometimes more than once. But this decade, they are relying on the doctrine of legislative privilege. Now, legislative privilege is a doctrine that tries to encourage our legislators to be candid in their behind closed doors conversations by saying what you talk about behind closed doors cannot come out in court, cannot be used as evidence. Now, whatever the value of legislative privilege in ordinary lawmaking may be, I can assure you it has absolutely no place when it comes to redistricting. Why? Because every one of those legislators has a conflict of interest. And what's the time-tested solution to conflicts of interest? Sunshine and transparency. And legislative privilege is in the way of that. But today in Texas, the Texas legislature has successfully withheld ample, substantial evidence in that redistricting case by invoking legislative privilege, not only to protect what we know those legislators were saying to each other behind closed doors, but now to protect their conversations with third parties. For example, a partisan national organization attempting to manipulate redistricting to partisan advantage. Protecting that as well means our evidence as to what they were doing in shaving Latino majority districts down to bare majorities where it's 50-50 at best whether Latino candidates of choice will win. They get to hide all that evidence behind legislative privilege. Prior to Shelby County, couldn't do that because it was all had to go affirmatively through a pre-clearance process. So not only has it become more difficult, more arduous, more expensive, as Tona said, it has become a game of hiding the truth behind long-standing doctrines that have no place when it comes to that most sacred right to vote.
So, Jacqueline, I have to say that one of the reasons why I'm so proud of the John Roberts Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act is because I, along with, of course, Senator Ben Ray Lujan, understand that Native Americans were not contemplated in the 1965 Voting Rights Act. And we want to advance and make sure that all minority voters have an opportunity and a voice in this democracy. Can you talk to us a little bit about Native Americans and the impact of the Shelby decision on Native Americans? We're proud in Alabama to have the Porch Creek Indians, and they're a celebrated part of our community, but would love to know your thoughts on this.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much, Congressman Sewell, for just having me and having Native Americans included in this conversation. It is just humbling to be here in this building, and it is fortifying to be in community with all of you. We are small but mighty, and we do make up the difference in critical areas and elections across the country. We saw a difference in Arizona from Native American turnout, and Native Americans make up the margins in critical election places like Wisconsin, Minnesota, Michigan, Alaska. We are here and we are wielding increasing power. And as a result, we are facing increasing challenges. I just want to say, the civil rights protections that were fought for here absolutely protect and advance Native Americans and the people I serve every day. NARF, the Native American Rights Fund, is the nation's largest and oldest nonprofit dedicated to advancing the rights of Native Americans. And we have brought several lawsuits over the last few years. And in community with a lot of the people here, the lawyers here have supported us as we bring these legal challenges. Those advances are only made possible through these collective efforts and through really standing on the backs of all the work that has been done prior and into the civil rights movement. I think it's helpful to maybe quickly paint a picture of life on many reservations across Indian country, because I think it will show how vulnerable we can be and how this change, this increased hostility towards voting rights impacts us. So on many reservations across the country, there are homes that are severely overcrowded, 10 to 15, 20 people in a 2 to 3 bedroom home. Those homes are unaddressed a lot of the time. There's no address on them. You can imagine how that makes registering to vote difficult. There's no residential mail delivery, so there's not mail coming. You can imagine how that makes voting by mail difficult. To get to a post office, it can be 20, 30, 40, 50 miles away. It's often a rural post office that is open on a Tuesday or a Thursday from 12 to 2. You have dirt roads, and all of that, of course, is compounded by extreme poverty. And so this collection of barriers is in and of itself extremely alarming. I think it's anti-American, and it's a failure of a lot of systemic issues that have created these conditions. But what we've seen is that this makes Native Americans incredibly vulnerable to the type of supposedly race-neutral laws that we're seeing proliferated today. So over and over again, we're seeing things like, ID laws becoming more restrictive, bans on ballot collection becoming more popular. But what that has is a substantial impact on the ability for Native Americans to vote, and that's going to be intentional. So I want to give a quick example. So Shelby County, of course, came out in 2013. Well, in 2011, Heidi Heitkamp was elected to Senate in a surprise election in North Dakota. And as a result, and her win was accredited to Native Americans. She won by an incredibly slim margin of about 1,500 votes. And Native Americans overwhelmingly voted for her. And so it was widely known that Native Americans flexed their power and were able to get a candidate. The very next legislative session, the the legislature passed an ID bill that required residential addresses.
Physical addresses.
As I said, many Native American homes did not have residential addresses. And so this is a blatant discrimination that occurred. We brought suit after we learned in 2014 that Native Americans in droves were being turned away from the polls. And, I think that this extreme example of discrimination from the reaction is news to many of us, right? We don't hear about this type of intentional discrimination that is occurring against Native Americans across this country. I think that what Shelby did is that it signaled that the Voting Rights Act is vulnerable, and as a result, there's a green light to trying these types of tactics to keep Native Americans and all of us from being able to vote. And so, of course, in direct response to the exercise of our looming power. And so, I think that as we sort of move forward collectively, I appreciate being brought into this conversation because we have, many more examples of this type of discrimination that's occurring, and many more examples of the type of blockage of access that we all deserve.
So, Dewana, talk to us a little bit about what the Shelby decision, the impact the Shelby decision has had on activism, on grassroots activism and mobilization. How has that changed? We're always very proud of you and our community here because of the woke vote and because of what you do at the Birmingham Civil Rights Institute. We want to commend you on that. But I can only imagine that it's definitely changed the way organization on the ground has to take place.
Well, thank you for even bringing that into the focus of this conversation. And I also want to thank you for bringing us into this sacred space for what I feel is really a sacred conversation. When we talk about the right to vote, I think that sitting as the president and CEO of the Birmingham Civil Rights Institute, and in context of the activism work that we're able to do at Woke Vote, I've literally written out 5 pages worth of notes from my colleagues here. But I think it's critical, and my colleague, Mr. Berry, who's our historian at the Birmingham Civil Rights Institute, when I told him and our team that I was coming to have this conversation, and our legacy students who are present here because they're going to be leading, and they are leading the current activism and work that we're doing at the Civil Rights Institute, I thought, how do we tie all of this together? Because the Birmingham Civil Rights Institute, our mission is first and foremost to preserve the legacy and the history of what happened specifically in Birmingham during the Civil Rights Movement, because we know that what happened here indeed changed the world. It indeed changed this country, and it continues to do so to this day. So we can't just talk about what happened during the Civil Rights Movement of 1955 or 1963 and all of that. We have to talk about how that impacts what we do right now. But let's do a Sanko for a moment to my sister Mala. Because I thought about when we talk about the Shelby decision, one of the things I thought is you are giving back power, or saying that the power for our voting rights goes back to states who have some of the most draconian and antiquated state constitutions ever. 1901 here. 18, in Mississippi, 1896, right? And you're giving back, or at least thinking that this is where we should really land that power, because this is a conversation about power. And if you don't know the history of that, it's hard sometimes to connect the dots even right now. So I think the other thing is to note is that the tactics that we are seeing, the reason why it's important to have places like the Birmingham Civil Rights Institute to remind us of the strategies that we saw during that time, these may not be bubble tests, Oh, but they are voter restriction, voter intimidation tests, right? These are the same types of, the same kind of strategies that we saw during that time. They are just wrapped and faced differently for the century that, or the time that we are in right now. And you have to call it the way it is. That is why we still at Woke Vote give the literacy test to individuals when they get ready to register to vote, to remind them of what had to happen in order for people to take this vote seriously or to get their vote. And I think what's also important, I heard one of my colleagues say, and I was thinking to myself, she said, you know, it's anti-American. And I thought to myself, I struggle with that. Because I don't know that it's anti-American. What I do think is anti the spirit of America. But it's not anti the way in which voting rights have been framed for certain groups in America. And I think it's important to note that because it also illuminates what our power is in terms of how we actually get beyond that. And that is where we sit today talking about the 60th anniversary. We all know we're in the year of the 60th anniversary of some of the most significant things that happened as it relates to the civil rights movement. We sit in a space right now that is getting ready to celebrate the 60th anniversary, or to commemorate, I shouldn't say celebrate, commemorate what happened here with the bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church in 1963. We already are commemorating what happened as it relates to Medgar Evers' assassination in 1963. This year was also the 60th anniversary of the letter from the Birmingham jail. And the reason why I bring that up, and this is back to Mr. Berry's point when we were in our staff meeting, is that he talked in that letter specifically about just and unjust laws, immoral laws, or the spirit of immoral laws, and how we had a responsibility to do whatever we needed to do, the sense of urgency around that kind of legislation. And that is what you are hearing right now, is that we are really right back in the space of the sense of urgency. So how did it impact organizers? It required us to go back to extreme, and I would say extreme, but it really wasn't extreme, because even the SNCC and CORE and all of the organizations that came together back that time, they seemed extreme, but it wasn't. It was organized, it was methodical, it was consistent and persistent, it was informed by decision, and the same thing we saw we had to do in 2017, 2020 and other times. We had to go back to some of those key strategies. Oh, we cannot provide resources at the poll. Well, meet us at the church on the corner first. Right? Meet us at the church on the corner first. Get refreshed. And then let's go, because we still going to vote, right? The other thing I think it required us to do is really look at and challenge, and this is work that we particularly do at Woke Vote, this theory of who is worthy of investment as a voter. Because there's a traditional model that says that when you are organizing or you're trying to turn out voters, that you supposedly talk to what we call voters with the highest propensity score. They have a record of voting that is, 40% to 100%. And that is absolutely a traditional pathway. But how many voters are we leaving on the table if we only start or feel that we can invest in voters who have a 30 to 40% or higher record of voting? We have not taken into consideration anything my sister has said about access to the vote, to the poll, to mailboxes. We haven't taken anything into consideration about the fact that people have been displaced, particularly in the last 10 years, higher than most other years that we've seen, due to climate change, due to things in the housing market, due to, we've had so many storms here, I can't even tell you. So the thing of the matter is, it's not a true reflection, the voter propensity score, of someone's desire to vote. It's absolutely not a reflection of their right to vote. We have a responsibility to give and to ask for every person to vote. And so we have said there is no voter propensity score in our work. If you are of age, you getting a call. If you are of age, you getting an email. If you are of age, you getting a text, right? Because we want you to know that there is power in that particular tool. And the way in which we know that there's power in that tool is because of what we're dealing with right now. No one would be fighting this if there wasn't an intrinsic power that allows us to consider ourselves differently, or to even consider ourselves in this democratic process. And so I'll close with saying that in doing that, though, And I think the good news of that is we are reimagining, and we had to reimagine what power looked like. And so I always tell even our staff, and I tell our activists at Woke Vote, I see Robin and others here, I tell them that, yes, voting is the tool. It is one of the most incredible and most important tools that we have. However, boards and agencies are important. However, school boards are important, right? However, sitting at nonprofit leadership boards are important because all of these things work in collaboration for a liberation strategy. So if we leave one of them on the table, we have disserviced ourselves. And that is why the Civil Rights Institute is so incredibly important, because we tell the story of here's what happened, here's what's happening right now, and here's what's possible as we move forward. Thank you.
So once again, I wanted to make sure that you knew that you can ask questions. There should be cards and pens or pencils next to you all. If you don't, raise your hand. And if you do have a question, please make sure you put it up in the air so that we can acknowledge it. Now, as we're doing that, I do want to go back to something that is, I think, it's disheartening that we still have this struggle on Section 4. We don't have an enforceability. They didn't strike down the enforceability of preclearance. They struck down the formula by which you determine which states are the most egregious, right? And so the reality is the only people who can do that, can put that formula back in, is Congress. So I really want to open this up to any of you all, but I want to start with Doug. Until we get a Senate that is willing to either make an exception to the filibuster rule or do away with the filibuster rule, we will time and time again, even after this Milligan case, where we're looking like we're going to get more seats, those seats are probably going to be, those seats are going to be in the House. So I'm going to be able to continuously pass the John Robert Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act out of the House. But once again, I'm stymied on the Senate. So talk to us about what we can do. What kind of activism, what kind of legal strategy, what do you suggest that we do? Because until we can get 60 senators to go along with us, we are stuck where we are now. And we know that people vote in their self-interest. And Republicans have figured out that and I know that many of the folks on here are nonpartisan, but I ain't. I'm Democrat, that they are voting, as long as they can limit the vote, they know that they can affect the vote. And so talk to us a little bit about what we can do, and I would love other panelists who want to join in that discussion about because even though the Milligan case gives us more seats, okay, great, we still have this problem of the Shelby County decision and the restrictive laws and state legislatures going unchecked. No federal oversight is what we're talking about.
I think if we could get people in both sides of the Congress, in the House and the Senate, to care as much about voting rights as they care about their damn gas stoves, I think we could get something done. That seems to be the hottest topic right now, is gas stoves. The same is true with Senator Coleman. If you get the governor and the state legislature to care more about voting rights than they do a piece of granite or marble or bronze dedicated to the lost cause of the Confederacy, then maybe we could get something done in Alabama. But in all seriousness, look, the filibuster is a major obstacle. It's been used by segregationist senators for years and years and years. And it is still, there is no regular order in the Senate. When I got to the Senate, I worked in the Senate in 1979 and 80 when they actually had regular order and they would debate. And you did not see filibusters very often, and when you did, it was because they were spending time together to try to carve out a compromise, an exception. Now it's just a deal killer. You vote and it's gone. And I think that there are some things that need to be done. I really strongly advocated at a minimum a carve out for voting rights this last time. But the irony is that every Democratic senator, including Senator Manchin, Senator Sinema, supported the Freedom to Vote Act. They just did not support any kind of change to the filibuster. I am not sure that a change is going to happen. A lot of people think it will. if Republicans take back control. It remains to be seen. It did not happen when President Trump was in office and Republicans had control, but this Senate is becoming a different Senate than it was in those days. And some of the newer senators that are coming in, I think, are ready to enact an agenda if they get control. I'd like to see the Democrats do it. I think it's time. Quite frankly, I think it's time that they do something to get rid of the filibuster and just let the chips fall where they fall. I really believe that, and I could be wrong about this, but I'm going to be optimistic about this. Right now, the filibuster is just a deal killer. It is simply, and people don't have to talk in certain areas. But I've come to think that if the minority believes that because there is no filibuster, that legislation is going to get enacted over their objection, they actually may be more inclined to talk and to work with folks to try to get some things done than they are in a Senate where they know they can it's just not going to pass unless they get that. I really would like to see more, and I think it's time that the Senate move in that direction. I will be honest, I don't think it's going to happen anytime soon. I know it's not going to happen before the 2024 election. We see that very clearly now. But I think it's time that the Senate get back to being the Senate that it was designed to be, and that is with open amendments. Let people vote, let people talk right now, and let them debate. Let them debate on the floor instead of just giving these just ridiculous political statements. Let them debate the merits, and let's take votes up or down and let the chips fall where they're going to fall. I'd like to see it happen.
So I know Tona wants to speak on this issue. I also just want to make sure that all of us are engaged on it, because it's going to affect every one of us on this platform and everyone in the audience, that state lawmakers are kings and queens. They can do whatever they want unchecked until one of these legal entities files a lawsuit and it goes up through the ranks. So, Tona, your thoughts?
So I just wanted to add, I completely agree. We've got to continue to push to pass the John R. Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act. There's no question. But I also want to say we should not leave states out of this conversation of comprehensive voting rights bills. So we have seen most recently in Connecticut the passage of a Voting Rights Advancement Act that included a pre-clearance provision. This is incredibly important. And we've got voting rights laws in California, in New York, in Washington, in Oregon, in Virginia. We've got to keep pushing. And I think that's something we should start to push for here in the South. The best defense may be an offensive strategy. And I think, to go back to what Dewana said, you know, Alabama was really the birthplace of modern democracy. You saw that in the fight, in the march across Selma's Edmund Pettus Bridge. That changed the world, and I think we can do that again. So we've got to fight on the state level as well.
On that point, I'd like to remind folks, and if you don't know the statistics, there are 5 states in this country where the black population is growing faster than the Hispanic population. 5 states: South Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana. That is a changing demographic, Tom, that's different than Texas. But it is a changing, and in those 5 states, over 20% of the black population under the age 30 live in those 5 states. So times are a-changing, and people know that on the other side, and that's why we're seeing it. That's the pattern we're seeing. So we've got to get out there, folks. I just wanted to...
As we're gathering more questions, I wanted to acknowledge all of the elected officials that are in the audience. I know we have state reps from Alabama, we've got county commissioners, we've got city council members. Will you please stand if you're an elected official and you're in the audience? Thank you all for being here. One of the questions that we got was, what can be done to teach the public about civic engagement and prepare voters and active citizens about the changing redistricting policies, and what can be done to create and sustain a civic leadership pipeline in the state of Alabama? Yes, Maya?
Well, answer to that question, one, we have a website called And Still I Vote. And Still I Vote. And it is a place you can sign up for access to, and we share information from across our coalition as well, but also to get more information and tools. YT Bell, as I said, who is right here, YT, raise your hand, has also been doing work and support and training for folks who need it across the region. And that is also across communities that represent our coalition, because I want to note that we also, when you add Latino, Native American, Asian, and Black, it is because we are collectively seeing an increase in our populations, and it is our collective power that is important. But I want to add one thing, just quickly to this previous point, because I agree on the personally, we haven't taken a position as a coalition on the filibuster. But I also want to say this: we see rules changed by some in power when it suits them, or things that are not rules called rules, like, oh, we don't allow a president's nominee for the Supreme Court to get a hearing if it's within 1 year of an election. That was a made-up rule. Didn't exist, wasn't written down, never happened before. Then suddenly it was a rule, and then the next president comes in, and suddenly it's like, oh, 3 months before an election, got to get these nominations to public hearing. We're talking about Supreme Court cases in a gerrymandered court because the laws so this is not, that's just the point. But I also want to say one other thing. If we don't pay attention to access, because we definitely need, and our Congresswoman is so right about, we need John Lewis Freedom to Vote Act, but one of the things they do is try to divide us. They try to divide us. They try to tell Asians they're going to lose if black people get something. They try to tell black people that it's Mexican Americans that are going to make them lose if they get something. We got to stop that. But the other thing we have to recognize is, we just have to stop it in its tracks. We just have to stop it.
That's right.
But we also have to recognize when we're talking about how we engage folks in these conversations, whether it's redistricting, whether it's litigation, Tona's incredibly important point about being proactive, we have to remember that the talking points and the engagement is about what people want to change and see in their communities.
That's right, yes.
So when we say to folks, you have to vote, they say, no, I don't.
Yeah.
If you say to folks, do you want more money in your schools? And they say yes, and then you say, okay, here's the path to getting more resources in your school, it's a different conversation. So just wanted to note that so we remember what's at stake and how we also engage people. It's about their lives.
Tom?
So I just want to emphasize that when you talk about greater civic engagement, we have to look to the schools. Dewana talked about the importance of school boards. That's where it can start, because the fact that younger people vote at lower rates than older people is the exact opposite of what should be. Right. The closer to you are to your formal schooling, especially if it includes civics as a part of your schooling, the more likely you ought to be to vote. It ought to diminish over time as you get further and further away from your formal schooling. We have the opposite situation in this country, and that tells us we have a real problem in our schools. And the problem is we're going the other direction right now. Because anybody who doesn't think that the assault on Black studies, Latino studies, Native American studies, AAPI studies, ethnic studies writ large, and that the attempt to ban books in school libraries is not about suppressing the vote, then we need to have a longer conversation. Because that is also about suppressing the vote. That is anti-civics education right there, when you don't tell folks the history of this church, when you don't tell folks the history of the movement in Alabama 50 and 60 years ago. That is about suppressing particular students' votes when they turn 18 and have the right to determine the future of our country.
You know, Dewana, it's never lost on me, and I'm sure not you as well, that we get to do what we do because 4 little black girls were killed in this sacred place. They didn't have a chance to do it. So it motivates me every day to want to do better for Alabama.
That's right.
And so going to the question that was asked, what can we in Alabama do to, in spite of these restrictive laws, get folks out to vote?
Yeah, so there's one thing I have to just address because I want to make sure, because narrative is so important. You know, there's an African proverb that says, while good news is putting the shoes on, bad news has traveled the world twice. Mm-hmm. And it's very true because people tend to believe that the bad news faster than they believe the good news. So I do want to challenge my colleague, Tom, about the turnout of young voters, because particularly in the turnout of 2020, young voters actually made the difference in key states all across this country. So the percentage of young voters that have turned out because of the issues that they care about has increased dramatically, particularly in the last election cycle. So I do want to share that. And the reason it's important to share that is because I do believe that part of the challenge we have is that there has not been radical succession planning in terms of leadership and power in many of our states. And the succession plan, I think, and I know that it's a sensitive conversation, but I benefit from people like the Sheila Tysons that we see in here, Commissioner Tysons, like the civil rights, the Birmingham City Council leadership. I benefit from the Pastor Prices because they gave me space to learn the process early. And that informed my understanding of what was possible, which then informed my vote and my activism. The problem is that there are not enough spaces sometimes for us to not just be told to vote, but be taught how to lead. Not just be told to vote or say someone died. I hate to say it. I remember when in 2017, when the distinguished gentleman was running for office, one of the things that we found is that there was a talking point out there about how he courageously, and we thank him for his work, advocated on behalf of those who were impacted here at the 16th Street Baptist Church and brought justice finally for those families and for this community. However, many of the young people that we were talking to had no idea what 16th Street Baptist Church was. So we could not connect the dots for them for that being a reason for them to turn out, right? We had to talk about instead power and what the power of their vote and what the power of their activism looked like. So yes, we talked about, Congresswoman Sewell, you talked about the fact that the state leadership are kings and queens. Well, my point is, let's stack the deck then. Let's stack the court. If that's what it's going to be, we need more kings and queens that care about what we care about at the leadership space. And we have to develop that starting at the school level and starting in places like the Birmingham Civil Rights Institute. So I definitely think that it's a radical succession planning that doesn't just look at what happens when a leader, an elder is transitioning out. It really has to look at legacy around the power of voting, the power of creating, identifying, resourcing the next generation of leadership. Because guess what? The economy that you are facing, so are they, and it's impacting them even greater. So to ask them to work for free may not be the day. They may not be able to work for free anymore or volunteer anymore. You might need to find a stipend because it's very important to participate in that democracy as well, to make sure that they are able to come out and get activated. So I'm telling you, if they have to choose between feeding themselves and helping your campaign, they're going to feed themselves. I'm going to feed myself. So I think that there's conversations to be had about connecting the power of the moment, the opportunity for continued leadership, and that succession planning that allows us to activate people around the vote more intentionally.
That's great. So, Jacqueline, this question I'm going to direct to you. The question is, how can we better organize around communities of interest to actually stop some of these restrictive laws from coming into effect?
Well, thanks so much. So I think, this discussion is prompting in me this discussion about increase in turnout, right? This idea that, all the hard work that we're doing is increasing turnout. And yet there's this active effort to keep us from exercising our power. And I think that injustice can be an incredibly strong, motivating way to get folks out to vote. But I have to say, in North Dakota, entire election cycles went by with folks under a regime that was patently unfair. And it wasn't until there was more national attention and a flood of resources came into North Dakota, that we were able to actualize the types of assistance that was required, and that we were able to actualize articulating that injustice to everyone, to let them know the story. Hey, you voted. Hey, this rule got passed to keep you from voting, and now, they're trying to keep you from voting again. Don't let that happen, right? And, it wasn't until we had the resources that we were able to start printing IDs and, creating addressing systems to try and address, the, patently unfair laws. But those resources, now that the spotlight has left, are dwindling. And, we were able to make reach a settlement agreement in that case that allowed for, the addressing issues to be addressed. But the structural problems remain in North Dakota. The distances to polling places. And, all those conditions that I explained before. In reservations today, polling places are not mandated on reservation. And so we have a Native American Voting Rights Act that is proposed that has the simple proposition that every precinct in Indian country should have a polling place. Yes. And that bill is actually bipartisan. Congresswoman Cole is a co-sponsor of the bill that was introduced. And I think that there can actually be movement on the Native American Voting Rights Act because it is such a simple and straightforward fix to a structural problem. So I think, when it comes to organizing, we have to remember that injustice is a motivator and resources move people to the polls.
Well, we're down to our last 10 minutes, and I wanted to pose this question to each panelist and have each person give no more than 2-minute response to it. The question is, what will the ideal future of the Voting Rights Act look like? What will the ideal future of the Voting Rights Act look like? I'm going to start with you, Jacqueline.
Well, I think the Voting Rights Act is a sword and a shield. And I think that, the future of the Voting Rights Act is that, post-Shelby, it is restored, that, the spirit of America is restored. That we say that, the Voting Rights Act is here and passed because we as a nation believe that everyone has the right to vote regardless of race and has a free and fair opportunity to actually exercise that vote. And so as a shield, it prevents the types of games that we see are being played today. And as a sword, it's robust in its tools for us as litigators to be able to come before a court of law, lay out our case, show an injustice, and get relief. And I think that basic process is being undermined today, and we urgently need the reform. And thank you for all the work that you're doing to make that happen.
Dawana.
Absolutely. I just believe that it's making sure that it lives up to why it was there in the first place. And the leaders that put it there, they put it there for a reason. They understood where we are. They understand who we are as a country. But I do hope that we get to a place where we don't actually, as leaders, fight those fundamental rights. And I think that that's what it's really about. And I want to applaud your leadership, Congresswoman Sewell, because I think someone said it earlier that you've taken up the mantle of John Lewis. And I don't want to miss that because that's a weighty moment. It's a weighty assignment.
But I'm not alone.
And you're not alone.
Got a lot of folks standing with me.
But activating on behalf of that, for that leadership and for that legislation, to me, it's making sure that you're fully empowered. And those who are fighting for that, that you see that come to fruition. So we stand with you. Thank you.
Tona, what parting words around voting rights and what ideally it would look like?
You know, I totally agree with and really enjoyed Jacqueline's metaphor about the Voting Rights Act not only acting to protect our right and everyone's right to vote, but also acting to really enable the full participation of what should be a multi-ethnic, multiracial democracy where dignity is sacred, power is shared, and thriving is the standard. That should be our baseline.
Absolutely. Tom?
I'm going to be a little wonky, and I'm going to say the ideal Voting Rights Act would redeploy that most powerful civil rights legislation, the pre-clearance system, in the most effective way possible. And that means not just identifying places like Alabama that have a long history of arduous work to suppress votes of people of color, but it also means identifying new jurisdictions that face the threat of a growing population of people of color and that seek to use some of the same tools borrowed from Alabama and Georgia and North Carolina in their jurisdictions. And as you know, Congressmember, that's a part of the John Lewis Act, a new pre-clearance formula that recognizes we not only have to stop, as I put it in other contexts, the serial vote killers, but the copycat vote killers as well.
Yes.
That's right.
And I'm going to go beyond that. I'm going to say I want to see it deployed so successfully that we start to use it in other areas of policy. I've said to education activists, can you imagine if there was a pre-clearance system for education systems in this country? Where would we be on education equity today in comparison to where we are? So that's what I want, is full and effective deployment of that most effective tool of civil rights history.
That's good.
Doug, what do you want people to take away from this panel? We've had a really healthy discussion about the impact of the Shelby decision. We're talking now about what an ideal Voting Rights Act would look like, but as our forever Alabama senator, what do you want us to take away around voting rights?
What I'd like for folks to take away is that this vote is under threat continually, everywhere, every day, and that it's up to us as individual citizens to challenge that, to make sure people have that access. I think if we can do what we've talked about here, the civic engagement, at the very local level to get people engaged, not just in a presidential election, but at their local Board of Education, their local county commission, their local city council races, their local state legislature. That's where the rubber meets the road here. And if folks can do that, I think that we can ultimately get to a place where we can do a few things on the Voting Rights Act. We can get the funds to secure our elections. I think we have to recognize, Terry, that there are millions of people out there who believe our elections are threatened right now. And we got to go where they are in the sense that we've got to make sure we do things to tell folks we want to secure the elections as much as you do. It's important, and we can utilize technology. We can give the funds to do that. We can target why people don't actually get out there to vote. I think so many in the South don't vote because they just don't think their vote matters. We got to make their vote matter. I totally agree with Tom about Section 5, and we got to educate people about what Section 5 actually did.
It's true.
And I think if we can educate people about what Section 5 did, they're going to start demanding it. And I'd like to see two other things. One, nonpartisan committees to redistrict Congress and our state legislatures. I think that is a huge, huge deal. And finally, if Congress could figure out how to have uniform standards among the 50 states for some voting, uniform minimal standards for early voting, for drop box voting, for mail-in voting, those kind of things instead of this hodgepodge we have to see. I think that restores people's confidence in the voting process. You've got to be uniform to do that. So those are the things, but it is going to start right here. It is going to start in those pews and pews like them all over the South and all over the country where people can get out and leave and just say, doggone it, this is important. Our democracy depends on the right to vote.
Thank you, Doug. Maya, last words?
Okay, that's a tall order. So I'm going to say, first of all, I just want to say I have learned so much from these esteemed leaders, and I'm privileged to have been here. And I agree with everything that's been said. So I just want to name what Senator Jones said. So what he said is, in addition to the Voting Rights Act, we get the Freedom to Vote Act. That's a separate piece of legislation. It was joined. Folks were supporting both because a lot of the election interference we've been talking about is also going to be protected by creating those national standards and saying one party can't tell people whether or how they're going to vote, period. So that's critical, but at the end of the day, what we're really talking about is, are we going to be a democracy? And so the ideal is that we don't have to debate, as we didn't in 2006, whether or not our government needs to ensure that we are a democracy, and that requires a recognition that rather than lying on us about voter fraud that doesn't exist, we should be moving barriers out of the way of the ballot and recognize that white people have always been harmed when people of color are, always have, and that if we want every last one of us to vote, then we have to take care of all of us.
Yeah.
Join me in giving our panelists a round of applause for their comments and their commentary, their leadership. We are so blessed to have you here. I just want to end this session by reminding us of what John Lewis said. You know, I'm honored every day to represent Alabama's 7th District, which is America's civil rights district. My job is not only to represent the people who are in the district today, but to protect and advance the legacy, the very rich legacy that is Alabama's 7th Congressional District. I do that work because I know that that is what the people who elected me to do, was to not only help them, but to advance the rich legacy of civil rights and voting rights in America. John, on his last trip to the Edmund Pettus Bridge, a very frail John Lewis, body riddled with cancer, he came on that to reenact that Bloody Sunday one more time. And he said, as people were holding him up, he said, "Don't forget your faith. We can and we must do everything that we can to ensure that every American has the right to vote." He said, "Keep your eyes on the prize. Keep your eyes on the prize and vote like your life depends upon it, because it does." Thank you all for being here. Thank you. Yep. Yep. Cliff, thank you so much. We're going to get started with the second panel in about 3 minutes, and we'd love for everyone to take their seats. Another exciting panel as a part of this symposium. Okay. Yeah. Now my pleasure to welcome our second panel to discuss where we go from here, the road ahead for voting rights, and the impact of the Supreme Court's most recent decision, the Milligan decision. As we observe the 10th anniversary of the Shelby decision, we are on the heels of a historic victory. 3 weeks ago in Allen versus Milligan, a majority of the United States Supreme Court justices delivered an opinion deviating from its recent anti-voter decisions. The court found that Alabama's congressional map dilutes the voting power of African Americans in Alabama and ordered the state of Alabama to redraw its maps. In issuing this decision, the court not only affirmed the importance of fair representation, but it also upheld the Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. It actually breathed life back into the Voting Rights Act, and the Supreme Court followed the law. That does deserve a round of applause. They actually followed the law. Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, loudly and clearly, the VRA is alive and enforceable. The decision paves the way for more equitable maps across the nation where Black and minority voters can elect candidates of their choice. For our second panel, I am thrilled to be joined by a group of esteemed guests, experts, litigants, lawyers, fighters for voting rights. Joining us today is Evan Milligan, the Executive Director of the Alabama Forward and the named plaintiff in Allen versus Milligan. We also have Cliff Albright, co-founder and executive director of Black Voters Matter and Black Voters Matter Fund. We also have Terri Minus. Where's Terri? Oh, sorry. My namesake. Vice President of the Consensus and Voting Program at Asian American Advancing Justice, AAJC. And Marsha Johnson, co-director of the Voting Rights Project at the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under the Law. And lastly, one of our own, Jerome Dees, who is Alabama Policy Director for the Southern Poverty Law Center. Please welcome our new guest. I'm going to do exactly as we did for the second panel. We're going to ask questions of each of our panelists. But if you want to ask a question, at the very end, we'll leave 20 minutes. And at everyone's pew should be a index card and some pencils to be able to ask a question. Just fill that out and hold the index card up, and one of the members of the House Administration Committee will come by and pick it up. So I'm going to start this discussion with Evan. So Evan, tell me why it was important for you to be a named plaintiff. What was the expectations of the litigation, and what you feel about the decision that was ultimately rendered?
Thank you, Congresswoman, and thank you for organizing this event, and also to your staff. Good morning, everyone. So I, as the Congresswoman said, I work for an organization called Alabama Forward, and we are a standing coalition of organizations based around the state of Alabama. Some of our members are here today, so definitely shout out to y'all. And these are organizations that work on a range of issues. You have the Alabama affiliate of Black Voters Matter, so they're working to mobilize Black Alabamians into civic engagement. We have the Alabama Rivers Alliance that's looking at climate and water issues, NAACP, on and on and on. They come together like Voltron or the Avengers, really to maximize the impact on voter registration, voter mobilization, and spreading pro-democracy values to every corner of our state culture. We were founded in October 2020. At the end of 2020, we went into some strategic planning, and our members were very clear that they wanted us to spend 2021 deeply engaged in redistricting. That was information that we took to heart as staff, and basically worked with allies, with our membership, to spend time making sure that community members knew about trainings that helped them understand how the census relates to redistricting, how political maps and the process of making political maps impacts their daily life experiences. And when the census data was released, we also worked with that same network of allies and members to do media briefings and public education events to invite more Alabamians into the process of letting the Legislative Apportionment Committee know about their thoughts, concerns, and ideas in terms of how they wanted maps for the state to look. And that not only dealt with our Congress map, but also Board of Education, the State House and Senate maps, and even local maps. So there were people that got involved in the process. We continued to try to help the state understand where the law was in terms of the Voting Rights Act, worked closely with LDF, with ACLU Alabama, to make sure that our elected officials had that information. Ultimately, they chose a map that diluted the voting strength of Black Alabamians, particularly those who live in the Black Belt. And so we filed a federal suit challenging that. And then how do I feel about the outcome? I feel encouraged. I also am usually very measured when it comes to courts in this country, and just the nature of the pendulum of political power in this country. And I think, a lot of our work, for folks on this panel and in the audience, I don't need to tell you that your work often looks like that Greek myth, the myth of Sisyphus, where he has to roll the ball up the hill and it rolls down, he rolls back up, and that's how he spends eternity. But he finds purpose in that, and he embraces his fate, and then takes every effort with renewed energy. And so that's sort of where I've been personally trying to place myself, and getting encouragement from that from our membership as well.
Well, we're very happy that you filed that lawsuit. Marcia represents the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under the Law. Can you talk to us about the transformational nature of the lawsuit and what it means for voting rights going forward?
Thank you so much for that question, and thanks for having me here in this very sacred space. The lawsuit means that the people were heard. I think it's really important to connect the record to successful litigation. And in order for lawyers to do their work, they need to put forth a strong record, and that record comes from the people, as Evan noted, and it did here. And so what this means is that we now have the wind at our backs. We forced the court to do the right thing because the people ensured that their voices were heard in the process. And now moving forward, we get to the implementation phase. There's always the really important things when it comes to litigation, is you make your case, you get your win, and then the remedy has to be implemented. And that's where we are now. And I think it's important to take for all of us to bask in this victory, but also know that there's work still ahead for that victory to be realized.
Very good. Terri, can you talk a little bit about the impact of the Shelby decision on the Asian American community, and also talk to us about what this Milligan decision means for that community and for all of us?
Sure. Thank you very much for that question. Thank you for having me here today. I think it's interesting that between those two decisions, there's kind of that push-pull. I think that a lot of folks are feeling. One of the important impacts of the Shelby County decision for Asian Americans was the fact that our community is rapidly growing. It has been among the fastest growing community in this country. And what maybe many didn't know, particularly around the census right prior to the decision, Asian Americans are really growing fastest in southern states. It has now, for the past census, sort of moved. The last census saw the three fastest growing Asian American populations in North Dakota, South Dakota, and Nebraska. But prior to that, we saw rapid growth in places like North Carolina, Georgia, and the like. And so I think for our community, part of what was so devastating was that we were sort of on the precipice of being able to really take advantage of pre-clearance and all the benefits, as Tom and others mentioned in the prior panel, and it just all went away. The other interesting piece of that too was because we are emerging, right? The last census, each state saw their Asian American population grow, right? There was not a state that did not see an increase in their Asian American population. The problem is we know that when we are in emerging communities, say North Dakota, South Dakota, Nebraska, where we haven't been, that's when sort of the shenanigans start to come out. When we reach this tipping point, this number or area where it's noted, oh, wow, you might actually swing, right, the power, the power dynamics here. And I think Jacqueline had talked about it in the first panel as well. And so that was another kind of devastating piece of the fact that we no longer had this strong protection in place that we could take advantage of. Now, fast forward to Milligan, the upside, I guess, for that is that because we have this growth, and in future redistricting cycles, we'll be able to take advantage of that and potentially build districts that can actually elect candidates of choice for the Asian American community, whether that's as a community in and of itself or as coalition communities with other communities of color. So I think, in some ways it's a mixed bag. But one thing I will also note, because I'll throw in another Supreme Court decision in for you, with that, we still have to remember that Brnovich is still out there, still needs to be fixed. So I think even though we should bask in the victory and bask with Evan right here, we still have to remember there's work that needs to be done. We do have to restore and modernize the Voting Rights Act, and the John Lewis bill being the perfect vehicle for that.
At the Southern Poverty Law Center, what have you been doing, what have you all have been doing to educate voters about post-Shelby and access to voting? And then can you talk a little bit about what your expectations are given the Allen versus Milligan decision and how it will impact Alabama voters, Alabama Black voters?
So as we sit here in this particular space and we soak in the sacred nature of the ground in which we sit, it causes me to think about the sacred aspects of our democracy. And so when you think about democracy in terms of that, in a religious capacity, there is doxy, belief, and practice, how it is put into action. And voting is the praxis of what our democracy is. We hold these truths to be self-evident. That is the doctrine aspect of our democracy. And so as we engage in coalition with groups like Alabama Forward, Black Voters Matter, ACLU of Alabama, and so many others, we are mindful of the many obstacles that have been erected to prevent individuals from engaging in that proper praxis of the sacred space that is democracy. Within the past several weeks, SPLC's put out a report detailing, in the wake of Shelby, as we look at the 10-year anniversary of that, what some of those barriers are. And so as we engage in that space with our coalition partners, a big thing that we are doing is public education of exactly where your rights stand, places that you can go to properly register and engage in that practice. There was an individual in the previous panel that talked about the concept of power and connecting that to individuals' desire and willingness to overcome those hurdles and barriers that have been put in place to prevent people from voting. And so, again, a part of that public education that we engage in is drawing that direct line between the resources that are available or can be available to respective communities and the practice of voting, and the importance of having fair, equitable, and true representation in all forms of government, whether it is at the school board level, at the city council level, folks that are sitting on your local water board, all the way up to the Congress and the Senate, and how that directly translates into the resources that then become available to those communities. And so that's a big part of the work that SPLC does, because while voting rights is a major issue that we deal with, it's incredibly important, as I've just stated, how that issue connects with issues such as health care, criminal justice reform, and the list goes on and on.
Yes. Thank you. To Cliff, this decision said that the Supreme Court said that the state of Alabama cannot dilute the power of the black vote. That was the essence of Section 2. They followed the law, and now the state of Alabama has to redraw its congressional districts in such a way that it doesn't dilute the black voter. So as the co-founder of Black Voters Matter, what do you think is the major impact of the Milligan case? And how does that change how you all organize black voters?
First, thank you, Congresswoman, for putting this together and for your consistent work. I heard on the last panel how they referred to you taking up the torch that, you know, your friend and mentor, John Lewis, left behind. And so thank you for all that you've been doing on this issue and so many other issues. You know, I think I have to kind of pick up where Terri left off. Because while certainly the decision was unexpected and it's certainly a victory, right, in one very obvious sense, there's two cautionary notes. You know, one being the fact that the Supreme Court could have decided this last year, before the midterm elections took place, right? And so, in effect, what they essentially did was it was a supreme stall tactic to let what they knew at that time were racist maps, were undemocratic maps, to be used in the midterm elections to impact Alabama's elections, to impact Louisiana's elections, to impact not just one, but 2, 3, 4 seats in Florida and a seat in Georgia. That literally determined the shape of power in Congress. And so for that reason, you know, we talk about justice delayed and justice denied. This is very much a case of justice delayed. The second reason it's a cautionary note is because, as you've pointed out, what they've done now is send it right back to the great state of Alabama and the legislature, the same ones that came up with gerrymandered maps, to now have to correct themselves, to now have to police themselves. And it's really not clear, because what the Supreme Court did not make clear is really what do they mean when they talk about vote dilution? Like, what do we really mean when we talk about majority, minority districts or black majority districts? There's really no guarantee that we're gonna come up with 2 majority black districts. In fact, we really even need to have a conversation about what does that mean? Because you got some folks, even supposed allies of the black community, saying, oh, we don't need majority black. We just need black opportunity. So I don't know about y'all. I travel all across this country in what we call the blackest bus in America, talking to black talking to black communities, and we're not talking about just opportunity. We're talking about power. We're talking about actual power. And so, this conversation about, we just want a black opportunity districts, that's not what the battle was for, right? That's not what this movement in Birmingham was for and Selma was for. And so, from our perspective as Black Voters Matter, we're going to continue to engage our communities to talk about this issue of power and what we expect to come out of these new maps, to talk about even beyond, this particular map. We really need to even have a broader conversation around, what does fair representation look like? There's discussions that Lonnie Guinier tried to have with this country 30 years ago about proportional representation that didn't get the hearing it should have got then, but if it did, we might not be in the situation we're in now. Because we have to radically rethink, what does fair representation even look like in a Congress? It's not written in stone that Congress looked the way that it looks right now. Right? And so we have to radically reimagine what representation looks like, because at the end of the day, while we have to restore and strengthen the Voting Rights Act through the John R. Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, but we have to think more radically about how we reform this democracy even beyond our traditional notions of voting rights and our traditional notions of civil rights. That's not as a replacement to these battles over voting rights, right? But it is to think more radically and more broadly around what it means to reshape our very notions of this democracy. Because I'm here to tell you, they're thinking radically about how to reshape it every day, right? They're thinking radically about how to make it radically undemocratic every day. In Ohio right now, there's about to be a referendum around whether or not state referendums get decided by a 50% vote, or does it go to 60%? Right? Like the filibuster that y'all were just discussing. That's radically undemocratic. But they're not shy. They are unapologetic about how they are attacking democracy and voting rights. And we have to be just as unapologetic in the spirit of love about advancing this democracy.
Very good. You brought up a very critical point. What did the Supreme Court say in terms of its decision? We've been talking majority-minority. What they said was that the current map that Alabama has doesn't give African-American voters in Alabama the opportunity to choose a candidate of their choice. Now, you asked what is fair in that instance. Is it okay to have an opportunity district or a majority-minority district? I just want someone on the panel, anyone can answer this. From where I sit, the only opportunity to have black voters in Alabama elect their own candidate is to have over 50% in both of the districts that have to be drawn. I would argue that given the racial polarization that exists in Alabama, where black people vote for black people 89% of the time, but white people vote for white people 98% of the time, that to give us a true opportunity to elect the people that we want to elect means that both of those districts, not just my district, both of those districts have to be 50% plus one. So if you were informing the state legislature right now, how would you tell them to approach this opportunity that they've been given again to draw a fair map? What advice would you give to state legislators in Alabama?
I think I would say that history serves as a clear record for how the maps should look going forward if we are truly trying to remedy the problem that is before us. Based on the statistics which you've shared, which are clear, demonstrable fact, nobody can deny that. I think if you are going to term them as true opportunity districts, you have to go based off of the BVAP when you are determining whether or not a district—
What is BVAP?
The BVAP is Black Voting Age Population. Thank you. I think you have to go based on that and look for numbers that are at 50% and above before you can truly categorize a district as an opportunity district. It has to be a majority-minority district going forward. And so as maps are going forward, we are kind of in the lead up to the redistricting special session, which will begin on July 17th and go through July 21st. We're in the process of having public hearings. We had one yesterday down in Montgomery, and we'll have another one on July 13th. And people are submitting various maps, as is absolutely their democratic right. But I think it is important that any map that receives serious consideration to go forward needs to include at least 2 districts that are at 50% plus in 2 of those 7 districts. Thank you.
Now, Evan, you were there at the public hearing. Just to set the stage, the Supreme Court then, after its decision, remanded it back to the 3-judge panel, and the 3-judge panel held a conference and set up the process. And what they said was that the state of Alabama had until July 21st to submit a new map, a remedial map that actually would comply with Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. And that means, rolling it back, the governor just announced that she is going to have a special session July 17th. All right, then the first public hearing was yesterday. Another public hearing will be July 13th. What I'm trying to say is time is of the essence. We don't have time to fuss about a map. We need to come together and choose a map that gives the leverage to the plaintiff's lawyers to get a better map for all of us. And all eyes are on Alabama, because we're the first to go. So I ask you, Evan, what do you hope the state legislature will do? And what do you expect your representatives in the state legislature to stand up and support?
I wish and hope they could
Notice I chose a non-politician to do that.
I wish and hope they could narrate the case in the way that you do, because it's so clear and inviting how you tell the story. I just want to acknowledge that. And also, we submitted maps, the plaintiffs, both in our case and
Say it
also
again.
the Castor case, came together, submitted a map that does feature 2 opportunity districts that are majority black. It would be District 7, which Congresswoman currently represents, and then a redesigned version of District 2, which would unite Mobile, the city of Mobile, with Montgomery, and going over to the Georgia border. So those maps have already been submitted, along with a letter explaining 3 of the features I'll mention to you. You know, representing the Black Belt has historically been difficult. District 7 only was born in the early 90s because of the VRA and litigation around it. And having an additional congressperson represent the interests of the people living in the Black Belt would require refashioning our congressional map. And so the map we've submitted has the core 18 counties of the Black Belt distributed between either District 7 or the other opportunity district, District 2. And that would offer more representation for those communities than they've had historically. And then those maps, there's another point about them I wanted to share, but just to illustrate your point, we have provided that. Now there's gonna be a very interesting conversation that we have as a state, that if you're a political junkie or historical nerd of Alabama history, you're gonna love the next month, because you have every generation of political leader on either party is gonna be at the forefront, and we're having this robust conversation about race in Alabama, you know, via this conversation about the map. Where that's gonna lead, your guess is as good as mine, but I hope that the members of our apportionment committee and then the members of the State House and the State Senate can insulate themselves from some of the external voices that have been informing where they stand on issues. And by external, I mean people who don't even live in the state of Alabama. And if they can find a way to social distance or put some type of wall around their thinking and look at the opportunity that we have here now, I think that would be really unique and something for me as an Alabamian who's been working here for, the last time I was in this church was in 2007 when we were doing the Equal Voice campaign. Mr. Zippert was there then, like he is now, other people, and it was different congressperson, but a similar thing. How do we bring people together? We know what we want, so how do we get someone to listen to us?
That was an amazing event, and it was Luis Gutierrez who was fighting for immigration for the 26 years he was in Congress and never saw an immigration bill. And we, the state legislature, had totally turned it on its head and tried to make it harder for us to be able to even help immigrants. What was it, HB 56?
So, yeah, I hope that we can lean into, what you just said, that somebody had been fighting for their career and not seeing the result. If our legislators, if they find, a quarter of what was demonstrated by some of these advocates in our state who never get recognized, they're never going to be on a stamp. They're never going to be celebrated with a holiday, and they've been giving their whole lives to this work. If they find even a 25% of that, I think we'll have an outcome that, even if we don't get what we want, at least we can feel, let me stop lying, I want what we want.
Say it again, what you want?
No, I want our map to be passed, but what I'm saying, though, is the process of getting it there, given the votes in those decision-making bodies, is not one that I can flippantly say, oh, we have the strength of the argument and that'll carry the day, because that's not how things work here. But yet we still sign up to do this work. So something is motivating us to do it. I hope that our elected officials can tap into that, because the people funding what they've been supporting who don't live here, that's going to require some bravery on their part to detach from that. And I hope they can find it.
Well, I'm obviously an interested party in this, and I do want some help in Congress to pass legislation that I think really does represent the majority of the people that I represent and that person would represent as well. I wanted to ask you, Marcia, we talked about the transformational nature of the Milligan case. We all know we were surprised. That means that not only were the activists who were trying to get it won were surprised, but also the Republicans were surprised. What do you think is a transformational nature of the Milligan case? We know it's affecting Alabama, but doesn't it also affect other states and other maps, not just congressional maps? Can you speak to it on a legal perspective as to what you think the import of that decision will be?
Yes, thanks for that question. And before answering that question, I do want to go back to what you were asking before about the 50% majority. Because one of the things, and this was discussed in the previous panel, it's the Voting Rights Act working together with the Freedom to Vote Act.
Yes.
And the point there is about election administration. So it's getting a district that will represent the voice of the people, but then you go to vote and you have all of these obstacles that are in the way. So that really strengthens the need for a majority black district, because that's half of the battle. You still need to get to the polls, be able to register, be able to cast the ballot, and more importantly these days, have that ballot counted and not challenged, and be able to support a challenge. So to me, it's speaking to what does it mean to have a voice, and what do the numbers mean, and how that voice gets exercised. With regards to your question about the impact of the Milligan decision, is as we know, Alabama is not the only state whose redistricting is being challenged. We're currently in Texas, we're in Georgia. How this remedy gets implemented, how the court's decision is interpreted, as you said, Congresswoman, you're the first, is how other states are looking at that. Other courts have already said, based on what the Supreme Court said in the Milligan decision, how does this impact your case? We've already had to respond to that question. And so as Alabama has, throughout its history, been at the forefront of what it means, what American democracy looks like, this case is also looking at not just what American democracy looks like, not just how it affects Alabama, but how the Voting Rights Act is interpreted. And as you mentioned, this was a decision that was unexpected for many, but like I said, I believe the court had no choice but to make this decision because of the record. And we can't let the record be wasted in how that decision gets implemented, because it's not just about Alabama. It's about how other courts and other parties are looking at the implementation of the Milligan decision and how it's going to affect Louisiana, how it's going to affect Texas, how it's going to affect Georgia, and all the other redistricting cases that are out there.
Very good. So, Terri, this is for you. Alabama's first, but yesterday, or was it Monday, the Supreme Court told Louisiana that they're next. They're up next. And that we can expect, if you're looking at what happened in Alabama, we can expect that there will be a conference of the lower court, and they will give a timeline and a process for Louisiana. And I would assume that that timeline and process will be just as tight as Alabama's is, right? It's really 7 weeks. My question, though, is as an advocate on behalf of minority voters, what is your expectation from the Milligan decision, and how do you see it being transformational for Asian Americans just as much as it is for African Americans?
So I think there's both the short term and the long term, right, effect. And I think in the short term, I certainly hope Evan gets everything that Evan wants. Would love to see that. And I think the reality is, and this is something I would want to see both short-term and long-term, is that the public input is actually taken into consideration. I think we often see there is a big show made that, oh yes, we're holding hearings, but we're only holding hearings during the day. But we're only holding it in, some, area that's not really accessible to folks, right?
And we're not giving notice until the day before.
Exactly. And we're not providing any, language assistance or disability assistance, and so there are all these, towards Marcia's point, around sort of barriers and little obstacles that get put in place. So I think that's one thing, certainly within the context of the decision, but also just broader in the context of redistricting itself. I think this is something that we can do more on, do better. I think Tom mentioned something about transparency and the need for transparency, particularly in the redistricting process. So that's something that I think would be really important. And I say that because I know that we all did a lot of work around the last redistricting cycle, as we've done in previous redistricting cycle, to try to engage our community members to participate and to attend these public hearings and to provide testimony. And it needs to be something that is rewarded in the sense, right? So having folks go to a public hearing and wait 10 hours because it's not well organized, or people, give up their own time, right? Time that they could be spending with their family, time that they could be, taking care of other business to give their input, and then maps turn around, they come out like a day after, and it's like, well, did you really take into consideration what I said? That's pretty clear. You already knew what you were going to do. You were just making a dog and pony show of having us come up. And so I think that maybe one hope is that with this sort of reaffirmation of the importance of making sure that our communities are able to, draw districts that provide us the opportunity to elect candidates of our choice, that how you find that out is by actually listening to the community. So it's not just the data piece, which is very important, and getting to that 50+1 and making sure that those districts actually perform, because it might not just be 50+1, it might need to be something else. If you have a population perhaps that's more immigrant, and so then you have to take those types of factors into consideration, but it has to be coupled with also the ground truth of what's happening. I always like to say, you need to have the qualitative and the quantitative together to really understand the full picture.
Yes. So Jerome, as a native of Alabama, and also someone who's been doing all the outreach, a lot of the outreach with the Southern Poverty Law Center, What do we as Black Alabama voters need to do in terms of mobilization around this next 6 weeks or 5 weeks that we have to really assert our voices, as Cliff was saying, and also to ensure access, voter access, which Marcia was talking about? What do we need to do? What is your recommendation for Alabama Black voters who will be impacted by the drawing of this map? What should they be doing? What should we be doing?
I think the key word really is to truly act in coalition, or community, rather, understanding that we are all in this together. And so I think by pooling resources, whether that's when elections come around, sharing resources as far as like making sure that like transportation is available for individuals. On the education piece, talking to your auntie, your uncle, your cousin, those that may not be political junkies, but informing them and connecting those dots between, again, why these maps are important, and that correct representation is made available in those maps. Drawing those dots, making that connection for friends, family, neighbors, church members. I think that's something that whether you are a political advisor, a lawyer, or an everyday citizen, that's something that we can all participate and engage in that has real world lasting effects. And as was stated before, we are on an incredibly quick turnaround. My estimation is that a lot of decisions are probably going to be made by the time we get to the public hearing on July 13th. There are a lot
That's the next public hearing.
The next public hearing. So again, that's another thing that people can do is show up in force, share your story, your testimony of the community that you come from. What are the interests that are specific to that community, the geography of where you are, and make that known. Put that on the record that the court is then going to take into account when they determine whether the legislature has acted right this go around or whether we are seeing the same cycle that we saw back in November.
But that's a very
21.
good point. You both on this panel, we've heard twice now about the record, setting a good record. Because ultimately, when Alabama submits its map, if its map is turned down by the court, then it goes to a special master, and the special master will draw the map. And so they will the courts will be looking at the record. And so the fact that the plaintiffs submitted 11 maps, 7 were submitted by the National Democratic Redistricting Committee, led by Eric Holder and others, and then 4 were by LDF. All 11 give an indication of what it is to have an opportunity district that is truly going to be representative and give African American voters a chance to do that. And all of them had 50% plus 1 in every one of those maps. So state of Alabama can't say that they don't have a guideline for how to go about creating it. And everything that is being said at these public hearings are critically important in making the case. So it's not enough to just have the plaintiffs come up and say that representation matters, fair representation matters, and we really want a fair map. All of us have to be engaged in that effort. And Cliff, I'm asking you, because you're representing Black Voters Matter and we do matter, how do we have our voices heard in this process of coming up with a new map?
Yeah, and I'm so glad you asked that, because we actually, much the way Evan was talking about, in several states, part of what we did during the redistricting process was to have community forums and to provide software where folks could actually participate in creating their own maps, and not just at the congressional level, even at the local level, right? What do you think is a fair map in your city council districts, right? And so that process has to continue now, especially has continued out, because as we've all said, this has got to be a process where everybody is feeling attached, everybody is letting their voice be heard, everybody is providing feedback. And so it's incumbent, and it's really a testimony to what we know about our movements in history, right? We need a combination of strategies. We need a legal strategy, right? But we also need an organizing strategy. And things work best when those things go together. A lot of people talk about the Montgomery bus boycott like it was just a boycott that ended segregation on the Montgomery buses, but there was a whole case that made it to the Supreme Court, Browder versus Gale, which was what actually legally ended it, but it would not have happened without the bus boycott happening simultaneously, right? And so we've got to be doing these legal cases and litigation, but we also got to be organizing our folks. There were a couple just real quick points I wanted to make to Jerome's point, and several people have touched on this, because I actually, and we have what some may consider a controversial position, because we think certainly black voting age population is a starting point, but that's not really enough for all the reasons that Marcia was talking about, right? So really we have to look at like what does actual turnout numbers look like to really decide what's or even what's a registration number like, because at the end of the day, some people say, and I say it's controversial because they say, well, you're trying to reward your community that's not voting enough, right? But when we know that there are structural reasons that Marcia was talking about why we're not, it's not just that we sitting on the couch and we just not motivated. We talked about, Doug Jones talked about the voter ID. There's the felony disenfranchisement. There's the economic reasons. There's all these things. So when you know those barriers exist, just looking at the voting age population isn't even enough. Right, but it is a potential starting point. And then the last thing I just want to say quickly, and it's not a small point, because you talked about how you're an impacted party in all this, and that's not a small point, because it would be easy, and there have been representatives, congressional or otherwise, local level, who in some of these discussions they'll accept the status quo because they'd rather be in a 70% safe district. You know that your district, once you say that there's going to be 2 black districts, that means I might lose some folks but you have been a champion on this issue in this state and otherwise. And that's not a small thing, and I didn't want to bypass that.
Well, thanks, Cliff, but the legacy of this district requires me to do so. And, when I think about what our foremothers and forefathers had to do in order to get the right to vote, if we have an opportunity to advance that and to give better and more power to the people that we represent, why would we not? Why would we not? Now, you're not going to be boo-boo the fool. You're going to try to influence it if you can, which is why I keep talking about the 50-50. We need both districts to be at least 50%. And if you have any questions, please remember to raise your hand write it on a note card, raise your hand, and someone will come and pick it up. We're down to our last 25 minutes, and I wanted to ask, I wanted to direct the discussion on the fact that it's not just about congressional maps, that the Milligan decision has import for every map that is drawn on the city council level, on the school board level, on the state legislative level. That is why this is truly transformational. Because if you can't dilute the power of the black vote in the congressional delegation, then you surely as heck can't do it in the county or in the city or in the state legislature. So I want one of our panelists to just speak to that, to speak to the ability of taking this Milligan decision and not just affecting congressional maps, but all maps. And I dare say that we in Jefferson County, we have 5 county commission seats. And there's a lawsuit that's pending that I'm sure will definitely now rewrite their briefs based on the Milligan decision, because we in Jefferson County have elected a black DA, we've elected black judges, we've elected back a black sheriff, yet the 5-person commission is 3 whites and 2 blacks. So let's talk about the transformational nature of that. Marcia, I don't know if you want to speak to her, or Jerome, go for it. Yeah.
I was just going to make a quick point that actually kind of dovetails with the point that Marcia made earlier as to how important the implementation part of what we are doing down in Montgomery with Milligan is incredibly important. The distinction between what exactly is an opportunity district, is it based on majority, minority as kind of that foundational aspect of it, or are we just looking for general opportunity zones based on overall partisan voting lines? And so when you allow that to trickle down, if certain factors are taken into place and maps that we don't believe are in the spirit of the Voting Rights Act and what the decision that came down should be, then that gets trickled down to state level maps and local county and city maps. And so I think that there's a through thread that we need to be incredibly cognizant of as we move forward in this process.
And do you believe that we should be that, even if we think that whatever we do, the state legislature is 2/3 majority Republican, and they're going to do what they are going to do, and it may ultimately end up in the special master's hands. If you take that approach, do you still advocate? Or should we still be mobilizing? Should we still be organizing? If the fait accompli is that no matter what we do, the state legislature will draw a map that probably won't be in line with the plaintiff's maps and may not get us the two majority minority districts we're talking about.
I think we absolutely continue to push forward, whether it is Sisyphean in nature or not. We continue to push forward, and if nothing else, continue to seed history with the record of us pushing forward and the data and the trends that continue to be present, because the demographic trends are not going anywhere. They are what they are, and they continue to grow in our favor. And so I think we absolutely do not concede that point in defeat. If we do that, then there's no reason for us to be here
Evan,
in the first place.
what do you think? Oh, sorry, Terry?
So I'm going to take a page out of Cliff's book and say something controversial. And I'm going to actually push back a little bit on the idea that the decision itself was transformational, because it is what the law was. It was just the Supreme Court doing the right thing, following its own precedent.
Yeah.
So in that sense, I don't feel that it'll be transformational as it is applied, other than it really closes the doors on some of the people who wanted to push the envelope. Where it may be transformational, I think, is the attention it gathered from people, and therefore impacting the ability to organize people to engage on this. There's already some knowledge about what is redistricting, why am I supposed to care, so you have a leg up. And that's where I'm hoping it might be transformational, to be able to get everybody more engaged in speaking up. And I completely agree with Jerome that you certainly do not concede the point, and you have to fight it. Even if you might be fighting a losing battle, it's definitely one that needs to be fought. And thank you, Evan.
Yes. Evan?
Yeah, definitely keep movement building. And I want to say to the young people that I'm looking at right in my line of sight right here, you all, thank you for being here. I'm sure somebody may have incentivized you to be here against your will. But we're talking about very complex legal matters, and if some of these terms are flying over your head, they fly over most adults' heads. This is some of the thickest political issues. But to break it down, I want to just share a little story, and then we'll move. When I was younger than you, my mother told me when we moved back to Montgomery that when she was a little girl, she lived across the street from this public park called Oak Park in Montgomery. And it's very close to the area where Dr. King and his family lived. It's the same neighborhood when they were working for the church at Dexter Avenue. And during segregation, my mom was born in '52. So when she was around 5, 4, 3, she remembers going on her porch and looking, and she lived diagonal from this park, and it was a whites-only park at the time. Her whole neighborhood was black, and majority black neighborhood, and was right next to a HBCU in Montgomery called Alabama State University.
The Alabama State.
The Alabama State. So this was not a place where there weren't black people there. but there was a dividing line. And on the other side of that line, you started getting to more whites-only businesses and neighborhoods. There were black children in this neighborhood where my mom lived who could hear the children playing in this park that they couldn't access. At the time, it had a carousel that played music. It had a little zoo, and there were animals in there. I think they even had bears. They could hear these animals making noise and talking to each other, roaring or whatever. And they could hear children playing in the pool. Now, all of these events that we talked about happened. The little girls were killed here at this church. There were marches, there were dogs, there were all these things that you see in your history books. And the laws changed. And when those facilities were desegregated, when that park was desegregated and the black children from that neighborhood were allowed to go, they took the animals out of the park. They cemented the pool. They removed some of those, the fun thing, the carousel and things like that. And I just want y'all to hold that, because when we're talking about voting, we're talking about public space. And voting is one component of how we regulate public space. And it's gonna be something that will inform what you do for the rest of your lives. There's a book called The Sum of Us by Heather McGhee that looks at stories like what my mom told from around the country. This didn't just happen in Montgomery. And so the narrative that Cliff and Terri were talking about when people they have so much fervor about attacking Voting Rights Act, it's informed by a story that started even before desegregation, but it certainly started then. We began to devalue public space after integration. And so that has continued to devaluing democracy, devaluing freedom. These things don't work perfectly, so they don't work at all. And you're gonna have to contend with that narrative. And what I would encourage you to do is look at the public space that you already enjoy. Look at your parks, look at your libraries, your schools, the festivals in your towns, and to think about how those benefit your lives, how they could be better, and how much time you actually spend in public space. Because if we don't understand that, it's easy to buy into the narrative that none of the other things matter. And that's where we draw our strength from in terms of movement building, because we're already living in these spaces and benefiting from them.
Great point, great point. My mom used to say, bloom where you're planted. You can make a difference right where you are. You're never too young. John Lewis was, 25 on a bridge with a backpack? He was a college student. So you can make a difference right where you are. Yes.
I just really want to build on what Evan was saying about the importance of history and today. And, to the controversial point about the transformational nature of the decision, I do think it was transformational in the sense that it's about the legacy of the Voting Rights Act. And before decision came down, we were very fearful about the future.
That's true.
Of the Voting Rights Act because of the trajectory that the court was going in. And this is why I feel so hopeful about this decision, because the Supreme Court had to take a pause in that negative trajectory, and it had to take a pause in that negative trajectory because it had no choice, because people spoke up and made their voices heard. And I'm really concerned about confidence in our democracy as we confront barrier after barrier to the vote, and every time we overcome a barrier, these supermajority legislatures put another barrier in place, and people can feel hopeless. And you can't discount the value of hope. And every victory has to be, especially in this time, has to be cherished and acknowledged. We take a pause to do that, but we know the fight isn't over. And then we pull up our sleeves and we continue to fight. So I think it was important that the court acknowledged its precedent with regard to the Voting Rights Act, and that is definitely something for us to build on.
Very good. A question from the audience. During the Alabama legislative session, Republicans tried to pass a bill barring Chinese Americans from owning real estate in the state of Alabama. Luckily, this bill was amended to not impact individuals and just the Chinese government. The bill activated the Chinese community in Alabama on this issue. The question is, how do we engage the AAPI community to get involved in Alabama on other issues that impact our communities of color, especially when it comes to protecting the right to vote? And this came from Senator Marika Coleman. This question. How do we engage a very small community in Alabama, but a very important community in Alabama, the AAPI, on issues around voting rights, not just issues around that were so offensive like this one?
So I'm going to start, and then I'm going to tag Evan in, because I know he's been doing a lot of great work engaging with the AAPI community in Alabama. But I think it's not that different in the sense of, and I know it's been talked about by many people today, finding the issues that matter, the day-to-day issues that matter, right, and linking them and helping them understand these, alien land laws, redux, 2.0, whatever you want to call it. It's not just happening here, right? It's clearly a strategy that's being employed in different states. And so helping the AAPI community understand the connection between how this came to be related to voting and who's in power and why it's important to be involved, and helping, whether it's the, I think Jerome, you talked about like talking to the aunties and the uncles and the family, and making sure that people understand the connectedness, if you will, of all of these issues. And then once you can sort of make that connection, then you can start talking about, well, what about K through 12? You care about your kids' education. Do you care about like public safety? All these different issues. And in that sense, it is not different than how, right, we all engage with our different communities. It's just needing to talk with the community and not at the community to understand what it is they care about and what their concerns are, to then be able to bring it full circle to help them understand why being involved is important, how being involved is important. The one additional thing I'll just say for the AAPI community is also making sure that if you're doing materials, if you're doing engagement, that it's done in culturally and linguistically relevant, manner is going to be very important, because that is an entryway, right, for us.
So, Evan, I think that building upon what Terri just said, how important is it in coalition building, not leaving out other minority groups and being involved and engaged, and how do we, working together, move us forward?
Yeah, it's important to model democracy and freedom internally so that we don't begin to model the same behavior as far as caste systems that we are opposing. And so I think with AAPI communities here in Alabama, there's been an issue around finding the right economics to fund people doing the, sort of like with social movement building, you have to have somebody that's willing to do what BVM and groups like that are doing, where you go and hold the line at the local community level, and you're there to do training, you're there to bring people into the process to figure out, well, what language are people speaking, what are their traumas, what are their goals, and then you find policy and information that can connect with where people already are. That's often work that doesn't pay a lot. And so if you have immigrant communities here, who are coming on certain visas where their children, they're born into professional households, so they have a certain amount of, and this is from friends, they have a certain amount of social pressure, not necessarily to do that type of low-paying movement building work. But this generation, this millennial and Generation Z, there are so many AAPI leaders around the country who have found their way to that work and found a way to make it happen. I think we'll start having leaders like that here in Alabama within the next 10 years if our work is effective. Not to say that we would play a role in shaping them. They know what they want, they know what they need, but they just need the structure, the resources, and connection to national allies who can give them social cover and also money to do the work that then you can have your policy groups, your elected officials, and other folks sit on top of.
Very good. One question was regarding the recent North Carolina decision, the Moore decision that came out yesterday. And that decision was a decision around that really squelched state rights and said that state legislatures, it was about a theory called independent state legislators, and the Supreme Court came out with a ruling that basically said yes, state legislatures, you have the right to draw the maps, but state courts and federal courts have the right to question those maps and to have they have the legal authority to do otherwise. So I wasn't sure if the lawyers wanted to address the Moore case, but that was one of the questions that we received.
Yeah, I'll start by saying that the Moore case was about checks and balances. Because it was really audacious for the North Carolina legislature to say that the state courts have no voice in what we do.
Yeah.
And it makes me think about what Cliff was saying about how willing, right, the suppressors are to go all out. They are not shy about taking on our institutions and the way we traditionally govern and saying, no, we're going to take, we're going to stop it. We're going to strike it down. We're going to put forth as outrageous theories as possible. And then we are always shy about, we have to stay within the lines. We have to stay within the rules. And, there comes a point when even, a conservative majority Supreme Court as we have to say, no, there's a line that you can't cross. But they're willing to put it out there. And we need to do the same thing because it's, reassuring to know that the court is saying, yes, checks and balances in a democracy are important, and we're going to stop the line here. But as Cliff said, that there are going to be other of these outrageous laws and theories coming, and we need to meet them straight ahead as well.
Can I?
Yes, please.
So I'm not an attorney, but as you know, I'm married.
But you're married to one.
A pretty good one, and
a family of attorneys. Actually,
that's right. And so I think it's notable that again, it's a victory, right? But there's 3 justices that said, yeah, this makes sense. That state legislatures have no checks and balances, right? And these are 3 judges that call themselves like originalists and all that. They want to go back to the original intent and all that. But they were willing to ignore over 300 years of precedent that legislative actions, state legislative actions are subject to review and checks and balances. And so again, it's a sign of just how far some are willing to go. And in this case, it was only 3 of them. But I'd be remiss if I didn't offer that part of this discussion around voting rights at some point has got to include a discussion around court reform, particularly Supreme Court reform, and whether that's expansion of the court, which I support and our organization supports, or whether that's term limits, ethics rules, whatever. Right now, we have a Supreme Court that really answers to nobody. And I think, the elephant in the room with some of these decisions is we're not sure that these decisions would have gone the same way if we had not just gone through 2 months of controversy around how corrupt this court, and particularly some members of this court, have been, and how much it's hurt by not having ethics, and how much, and again, this isn't partisan, this is just a objective reality. Most people in the country don't view this as a legitimate court because of many of these scandals, and so we're not sure how much of this is in response to that, really.
very astute points by my colleagues here. The one thing I just wanted to also flag, and I think, Cliff, you had said something about a combination of strategies before, right? And Marcia, to your point of sort of, and Cliff, your point of sort of how outrageous people can be, one of the perhaps intended consequences, or maybe just an unintended consequence, is that by being so extreme, it makes things seem moderate or okay that we never would have accepted as moderate or okay, right? I mean, so I won't call out names, but there are certain justices that perhaps made really bad decisions before that now we're like, oh, he's great because he's, you know, going to be the one who's going to say things. But that's only because we now have other people who are willing to buy into crazy ideas. And so there is this fear that the other side has significantly more resources, are much more brash in their willingness to go all out and not be constrained by rules and common courtesy. And as they keep pumping more and more of that out, whether it's through misinformation, disinformation, and whatnot, what becomes acceptable or what becomes, I think skews towards that extremism. And so we really do need to the idea of resources, make sure that part of our combination of strategies is to go on sort of that narrative and being bold, I think, Marcia, which is what you were, hinting at, with how we see things and how we want to see things so that we can counterbalance that to keep the middle in the middle rather than everything skewing towards, the more extreme vision.
Very good. We're down to the last 10 minutes, and I wanted to give each panelist an opportunity to close us out with a few words. And really what I wanted to want you all to talk about is, what does fair representation look like? And what does this opportunity mean, the opportunity that Milligan provides for minority voters? What does it mean? And literally, I guess, what you want this audience to take away from our discussion about the way forward. I'll start with you, Jerome.
I think that fair representation, and this is something that SPLC works on daily at the state legislature, and with individuals like Senator Marika Coleman, as we try to include diversity language in any sort of board or commission that's created, is that we want a governing body that is reflective of the geographic, racial, and socioeconomic diversity that is present in the state of Alabama. And so if we have congressional maps, state district maps that are inclusive of that diversity and reflective of that diversity, then I think we get closer to a true, fair, representative democracy. I can go ahead and speak to what I would hope that this body gathered here today would take away, is that there is incredible, absolutely incredible work that is being done on the ground here in Alabama in coalition efforts. Again, as I said before, whether it is people in the policy space, incredibly brilliant legal minds, community organizers that are out in the streets, making that connection from the State House to kitchen table issues. Alabamians are not just sitting back helplessly waiting for the off chance that the Supreme Court is going to step in and do what it's supposed to. In the same way that we look at the individuals in the 1950s and 1960s, the Fred Grays, the Abernathys, the Shuttlesworths, that are lionized today for the incredible work that they did, there are similar individuals, young folks, old folks, white and black, who are doing a lot of that very same work right here in Alabama and across the Deep South, to be sure. And so I think it's important that we are cognizant of that, and we're able put resources behind those individuals. There's no need necessarily to reinvent a wheel when there are people that are already on the ground doing that work. And so what I would call on for national organizations that do want to step in and care about issues like democracy, voting rights issues, or if you care about ancillary issues that are directly connected to voting rights, like criminal justice reform, healthcare access, expanding Medicaid, which is a huge issue here in Alabama. Find an organization that is boots on the ground in Alabama, that has a history of actually doing the work and getting directly connected to affected individuals, and find ways to genuinely support them that are in uniform with the beliefs of whatever organization you're a part of.
Thank you, Jerome Dees of the Southern Poverty Law Center. Each panelist will have about 2 minutes because we're trying to wrap up, but I do want to know what you feel about fair representation, what it looks like, and also what you would like this audience to take away.
To me, fair representation is having unfettered access to our democracy. That includes to the vote, it includes to our legislatures, and having our voice and our opinions considered. I'm really concerned about the rise of super majorities in the state's legislatures, and it gets back to how the maps are drawn, and pushing out and ignoring voices in our community. That's not what democracy is. And fair representation means that my position is considered at a minimum in when policy is decided. And that gets to my next really quick point about the takeaway for the audience, and I would say accountability. A lot of conversation happens around voting, and then I know you don't, some of you don't hear from your representatives again, but it's also work that you need to do, not waiting for representatives to approach you, but for you to approach them as well, and make sure that your concerns and what you care about is being considered between elections. It's not just about when we go to vote.
Marcia Johnson from the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under the Law. Evan?
So we need a national movement in the country that understands the connection between constitutional rights and legislative advocacy and community-based organizing. We will continue to revisit these issues, at least until we have a constitutional amendment to the U.S. Constitution that establishes that voting age American citizens have the right to vote and to have that vote counted. It may be, I went all the way through law school. I'm not a practicing lawyer, but I did finish law school, and it didn't dawn on me until I got involved in this case and then the redistricting work that we don't actually have an amendment that establishes that. Now, the Reconstruction amendments refer to it, but it's not explicitly established at the federal level, and that leads to a wide latitude. Now, when we talk about ratifying a new amendment, that's where we lean on your expertise and the expertise of the House Administration Committee and people who know, and you're already like rolling your eyes at it. I know you're being polite, but I know. But there was a point where we hadn't gone to the moon, and people would roll their eyes at that. Now we're talking about going to Mars. So what I would want is what is the list of things that we have to do to make that happen, whether it takes 20 years, 30 years, and then find a movement that can build around that.
Evan Milligan, Alabama Forward.
So I think for me, I agree with everything that everyone said, but I was going to take a slightly different approach. And for me, fair representation starts with accurate census data, right? You can't draw
the underrepresentation of our community.
When you have undercounts, as we've seen, traditionally in our communities, I know in the Latino community in 2020, there were serious undercounts, same thing in the Black community, in the Native American community, and even in my community where at the national level you saw a quote unquote overcount, we still know, because we did a report, which I invite you to read, we know that in 68% of the counties in this country, there was actually an undercount of Asian Americans. And so when we are missed, districts that are drawn where you have higher numbers of people being missed, they are going to be bigger. They are not going to be equal population. And so I think, as to the takeaway point that Marcia said, that we have to worry about census all the time. It takes an entire decade to take a census, right? So if the Census Bureau isn't properly funded year in, year out, they're going to make bad decisions. They're not going to be properly researching what they need to research. And then we'll get to another census, and we will once again see our communities being missed more often than others. And so I would just throw that in, that it's just not to give you all another issue to work on, but I am giving you another issue to work on.
Terri Menace, who represents Asian American Advancing Justice. And last but certainly not least, Cliff.
So real quick, just on the fair representation question, the only thing I'm going to add is, and this might be adding another area of work, but part of fair representation is that you have the ability for those that represent you to actually do their job. And what we are seeing is a wave of, whether you call it preemption or some of the other tactics, we're seeing a wave of where some folk are saying, okay, yeah, you can register, yeah, you can vote, yeah, you can actually win the election, but we are not going to let your city govern itself. We're not going to let your mayor govern itself. Whether that's Birmingham not being able to do living wage, or whether it's Jackson, Mississippi, right? We're seeing a wave of this, and that's not fair representation, right? Nor is it actually having actual voting rights. On terms of what I want those watching this to take away, three things very quickly. One, this work has got to be done throughout the year. It can't just, and every year. There's no such thing as an off year. I'm glad to see this panel even happening in what some people look at as an off year, an odd number year. It's got to be done 365 days out of the year, and we've got to support groups that do that work. Secondly, coalition or the lack of coalition is not an option. Right. I'm so glad that Terry's here, and our friends from MALDEF were here, and from North Early, the indigenous communities. I believe, in our organization believes, as Dr. King says, that we are all tied together in a single garment of destiny, right? And so coalition is a must. And then lastly, and this touches on what Evan was saying, most importantly, what I want folks to leave here with is belief. We have got to believe that a better world is possible. We've got to believe that victory is possible. Several folks today have talked about how we are sitting in a sacred space. And it's sacred not just because of what happened to those 4 little girls. It's sacred because of what preceded that. Yes. That children, to Evan's point, young folk in this city met right here, left from here to Kelly Ingram Park, and changed the history of this city, this state, and this country. Armed with nothing else other than their belief that something was wrong in Birmingham, something was wrong in this country, and that they somehow, at 6, 7, 8, or 18, that they had the power to correct it. So if they can have that belief and change this country, certainly those of us watching this right now can believe we've got the power to change voting rights and to change the shape of this democracy.
Cliff Albright, Black Voters Matter. Please help me thank our wonderful panelists for the second panel. What an amazing discussion, and I want to thank all of you. I want to once again thank Reverend Price for allowing us to be in this sacred place at historic 16th Street Baptist Church, where 4 little girls were killed, and we will commemorate the 60th anniversary come September 15th, 2023. I would also like to thank our esteemed panelists and, of course, the hardworking team, Team Sewell, as well as the Committee on House Administration, amazing staff, and everyone who's made this possible. In the decades since the Shelby decision, one thing is clear: old battles have indeed become new again, and we must remember that the people who came before us were strategists. It didn't happen. It wasn't by happenstance that Selma happened or that Confrontation C happened. They were strategists, they were tacticians, and we can learn from them. As old battles become new, we need to erect their same tactics. And working together, I know we can. In the months to come, I am looking forward to joining together with these activists and introducing the John Robert Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act once again into the House of Representatives, because we know that even though the Milligan case was a historic victory, it was, even though it may not have been transformational, they were just following the law. We'll take it. But we know that our work is not done, right? As long as state legislatures around this country can continue to pass suppressive voting laws unchecked by the federal government, we need to restore federal oversight. And that's exactly what the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, I look forward to reintroducing it in September. And likewise, the Freedom to Vote Act, working hand in hand with restoring the full protections of the Voting Rights Act. We must have voter empowerment. We must have voter access laws. We must make voting a federal holiday so everyone has access to it. There's so many things that we can do, and working together, I know we'll get it done. On behalf of the House administration, as well as the Subcommittee on Elections, I want to again thank all of you for being here, and do know that the struggle continues. It continues, and we should remember what John Lewis said. Ours is not the fight of one day, 1 week, or 1 year. Ours is the fight of a lifetime, and everyone plays a part. Thank you. We're going to take a picture up down front.